Chapter 1111. Auspicious View Garden, Floating Space City. The situation had become more and more serious. The news from the north proved that the Light of Truth Floating Space City had been attacked by the Star Beasts. Although a clone of the Emperor of Arcane had defeated the enemy there, the scattered invaders still brought all kinds of unimaginable disasters and losses to the Arcane Kingdom. Remote villages and cities fell one after another, and areas of human settlements were slaughtered and burned down. There was not much time left for the Morian Plain. The upper echelons of the Arcane Kingdom were well aware of the disaster faced by the Morian realm, but when the news reached the middle echelons, the relevant content was much simpler and cruder. And when the news reached the ordinary Arcanists, the information was so vague that it was difficult to tell whether it was true or false. As for the ordinary people at the bottom of the realm, they were the targets of abandonment. Naturally, it was impossible for them to know what kind of disaster was about to befall them. The large-scale selection of arcane apprentices took place abruptly. It wasn't the time for the selection of arcane apprentices, but the floating space cities in various places had issued mandatory orders to the regions under their jurisdiction to select excellent arcane apprentices and send them to the floating space cities. A large number of excellent and talented children were selected and sent to the floating space cities one after another. The city, which was facing a great danger of war, was rejuvenated by the injection of a large number of living blood. The Empire was retreating. Such news was no longer a secret, but it had become a heated topic of discussion among all Arcanists and apprentices. Most of the Arcanists were naturally included in the retreat list, but the Arcane Apprentices list was relatively small. As the center of Arcana in Kintaslo, Ruyan Province, the floating city of Ruyan had 30,000 Arcana apprentices living, studying, and researching here. Together with the newly selected young fellows, the number was close to 50,000. According to the authoritative information circulated internally, the number of apprentices that the Arcane Kingdom could transfer was up to 4,000. After all, the entire Arcane Kingdom had 7 continents, more than 20 provinces, and 76 floating space cities. Even if each floating space city only selected 4,000 people, that was a huge number of nearly 300,000. Besides, apart from the future Arcana apprentices, every floating city also required the relocation of a large batch of Arcanists, Arcana equipment, and all kinds of sophisticated instruments. There was also a huge amount of resources and materials, as well as all kinds of daily necessities. To be honest, even the quota of 4,000 arcane apprentices was squeezed out by the upper echelons of the Arcane Kingdom after they gritted their teeth and gave up a group of Arcanists with no development potential. However, the people at the bottom would never be able to understand the good intentions of the higher-ups. They were still obsessed with the simple comparison of numbers. 50,000 versus 4,000. What a huge disparity between the two numbers. If the units behind them were gold coins, the huge disparity would be enough to make people secretly sigh in amazement. But if the unit behind them was human life, the value of the immersion was even greater, to the point that it was difficult to estimate in detail. Over the past few days, everybody in the floating city of Auspicious View Garden had been anxious. All the Arcanists were busy with the transfer of resources and the allocation of assets. As a result, most of the Arcana institutions and facilities had been shut down. Those Arcana apprentices who were at a loss were either inquiring about the withdrawal list or knowing that they had no hope of squeezing into the list of 4,000 people. They could only pack their luggage and prepare to return to their homeland and hometown. Although it was difficult for them to understand the current situation of the war, and it was difficult to know the dynamics of the higher-ups, but the difficulty of the situation was obvious to all. In the territory of the Arcane Kingdom, there had been 6 or 7 terrible incidents of foreign invaders openly attacking the floating space city. Although most of the attacks were repelled and the invaders were destroyed, there were still 2 floating space cities that became sacrifices of war, and they fell from the sky amidst the wailing of thousands of people. The floating space city fell. Such a thing had almost never happened in the history of the development of the Arcane Kingdom in the past 10,000 years, so the confidence of the people of the Arcane Kingdom was particularly tragic. The floating space city was no longer the sky garden that would never fall, and it was no longer the arcane fortress that was absolutely safe in the hearts of the people of the arcane kingdom. Many news from all over the world also showed that most of the invading monsters were targeting large cities and the floating space cities. Therefore, in the case of the arcane kingdom's decline, staying in the floating space cities would not only not feel safe, but it was even more worrying. Many arcane families who were not qualified to join the withdrawal fleet had to find another way. They built some shelters in the most desolate and secluded places on various continents, ready to welcome the coming dusk of arcane magic. Therefore, those arcana apprentices who were not selected in the list of 4,000 people were also anxious to rush back to their families as soon as possible and strive to occupy some better positions for themselves and their relatives in those safe fortresses. And in order to strengthen the prestige of their families and to seek a greater right to survival, they were also trying their best to win over some helpless high-grade apprentices. And Lucia, as a beauty with the title of senior apprentice in alchemy and puppet making, naturally received the most olive branches. Unfortunately, Lucia was unmoved, and she simply refused everyone. She still went on, as usual, shuttling between the Arcane Research Room, the library, and the Arcane Academy every day. On this day, Lucia, as usual, was holding a thick pile of arcane books and hurrying along the familiar white path, surrounded by apprentices who were also in a hurry. There was no smile on everyone's face, and there were no more relaxed young figures beside the soft beaches and beautiful fountains. The whole floating space city seemed to have fallen into a kind of low pressure, depressing and painful. Lucia walked silently with her head down. It was not until she saw a familiar corner of a cloth robe and a pair of exquisite arcane leather boots that she stopped in surprise and raised her head. The person in front of him was the handsome, young acolyte Sauron, who exuded a heroic aura. His brows were knitted, his face was haggard, and he looked like he was suffering from a lot of things. "Soren, you haven't left yet?" Lucia covered her mouth in surprise. Looking at Lucia's beautiful and bright eyes, Soren's dry mouth opened and closed several times and finally spoke. "My grandfather has decided to evacuate today. Congratulations. I will bless you." Lucia's face showed a sincere smile. Soren's painful eyes carefully examined Lucia's face, but he could not find any trace of falsehood or pretense in her smile. "Grandpa has urged me to leave. I just want to ask you one last time. You really don't want to go with me?" Lucia slowly stopped smiling and shook her head solemnly again. "Lucia, I take back what I said before. I won't use this quota to force you to do anything anymore. You're free. Come with me. I won't force you to do anything you don't want. I just ask you to go with me, okay?" Soren said with difficulty. The expression on his face was painful and distorted. Obviously, he had made a great determination to make this decision. Lucia was stunned at first, and then a beautiful smile slowly bloomed on her face. She took a step forward, cupped Soren's face, and willingly gave her first kiss. However, just when Soren was about to go crazy with joy and wanted to hold her, Lucia suddenly stepped back and got out of his arms. "Soren, let's go." Lucia's little face was still red from the kiss, just now, full of breathtaking brilliance. "This kiss is our farewell gift. We may never see each other again, so I hope you can leave without any worries for the future of the Empire, for the inheritance of Arcana civilization." "No, Lucia, I can't leave you here." Soren fell from the peak of joy to the deep valley, obviously unable to accept the reality in front of him, and his voice was almost hoarse. "I won't leave." The shyness on Lucia's face faded, but because of the strange look in her eyes, there was another layer of holy brilliance. "My life belongs to Arcana. Even if I face death in the next moment, I will not stop my steps. This is the oath I made when I was elected as an Arcana apprentice, and it is also the belief I have pursued all my life. So, even without this disaster, we are not destined to be together. I hope you can understand my feelings." Soren's expression was painful and sad. After a long time, he finally got out of the way to the Arcana Academy. Lucia took a deep look at him and hurriedly set off again. Looking at the pretty and determined figure, Soren felt as if his heart was being cut by a knife. Soren finally shed tears. Unknowingly, an old arcanist appeared beside Soren. He also silently looked in the direction where Lucia disappeared, and his eyes were full of loneliness and pain that couldn't be concealed. "She's a good girl. Unfortunately, she doesn't belong to you," the old man said bleakly. "If I were as carefree as she was, maybe I would make the same choice as her." Unfortunately, the old man lowered his head and adjusted his mentality, then raised his head again. "Let's go, Soren. There's no hope here. The task of rebuilding a new Arcana kingdom in another world isn't easy. Your future isn't here, it's far away. The glory of Arcana, the glory of the family, we're all old. These can only be inherited and carried forward by you. So, cheer up, bite the bullet for the Arcana kingdom, for the Jonas family. Live strong." Soren's body trembled slightly. After a long time, he finally wiped his tears, turned to face his grandfather, nodded and said, "I understand. Let's go, Grandpa." Chapter 11-12. The biggest change after the merger of the Calamities and the Magi was that the speed of their advancement had increased. According to secret intelligence, the world of gods, the Abyss world, the Titan Gold family, the Star Alliance, and other powerful astral beings had invaded the Morian plane. Therefore, every day they stayed here was a huge risk. With such a huge and profitable target like the floating city, there were definitely more than one or two that had their eyes on them. Moreover, among the missions given by the A Squadron, attacking the floating city at Auspicious View Gardens was the most important mission of this trip. Therefore, on the 7th day, after forming an alliance with the Lesser Lord of Calamities, Grimm and his party rushed to the floating city day and night. The floating city of today was vastly different from what it had been in the past. There were obviously fewer towering arcane towers, and even a number of necessary arcane watchtowers had been reduced to an extremely low level. Below the floating city's massive body was a golden grassland where countless refugees from all directions gathered. They struggled to climb onto the floating discs, trying to hide in the floating city that had a sturdy arcane barrier. A large number of arcanists and apprentices were yelling and commanding the tall arcane puppets to maintain the order in this place. Among the crowd, there was also a long line of carriages and horses, transporting all kinds of materials and supplies that the floating city urgently needed. When Grimm, Heli, and Shiolisha climbed up a small hill and watched everything from afar, a large group of mutated beasts climbed over the hills, crossed the grassland, and began to appear below the floating city. Immediately, the people gathered below the floating city, waiting for the floating discs to arrive, began to panic. Countless men, women, old, and young screamed in fear, desperately fleeing into the distance. The frightened horses ran around in the crowd, making the situation more and more difficult to control. A few floating discs that had landed on the ground and were carrying supplies, and people quickly rose up, wobbling as they flew towards the floating city. There were still many people clinging to the edge of the discs, screaming and crying for help. Finally, when the discs rose into the sky, the people clinging to the edge were exhausted, screaming and falling from the sky one by one. The arcanists and apprentices who stayed on the ground to control the situation had nowhere to run. They could only desperately command the arcane puppets to form a circle, protecting themselves and some of the refugees inside. Grimm could clearly see that the natives on the other side were like a swarm of ants. Outside of them, a black wave was rapidly approaching. There were all kinds of mutated beasts, and all of them were vicious and cruel. Thus, as soon as the two sides made contact, a clear line of blood erupted from the front of the battlefield. This place was close to the floating city, so the number of apprentices who had mastered basic arcana techniques had also increased. Amidst the crowd, energy balls of various colors rained down on the group of mutated beasts, exploding into flesh and blood and countless broken limbs. However, How could this bit of elemental attack stop the attacks of the mutated beasts? Like bubbles raised by an enormous tide. Before anybody could cheer for them, the crazy aberrant beasts had lunged into the crowd and taught the Arcanists a good lesson with their fierce bites and sharp claws. Creak, creak, creak. 3-meter-tall arcane puppets marched forward with heavy footsteps, pushing through the crowd and appearing in front of the group of mutated beasts. They were not metal puppets, but arcana creations that had been activated. There were not many metal parts on their bodies, and their entire bodies were pieced together by waves of arcana energy. There were only a few thin metal rings in a few key areas, binding the arcana energy into a humanoid form. After such a transformation, the physical attack and defense of the arcane puppets would definitely be greatly reduced, but they would strangely have the ability to cast arcana spells. As they strode forward, they raised their hands and shot out energy balls, the power of which was as high as 80 or 90 degrees. This kind of attack power was equal to that of a normal grade 1 wizard, but it was faster, almost one ball every 2 seconds. Facing this group of arcane puppets, the leaders of the group of mutated beasts immediately went berserk, charging into the crowd while enduring their attacks, starting a massacre. This batch of less than 30 arcane puppets did not even last for a quarter of an hour before they were quickly destroyed. Seeing that the situation was not good, the Arcanists all leaped up, wanting to escape back to the floating city before the swarm of mutated beasts surrounded them. Unfortunately, they had acted a little too late. There was also a large number of flying beasts in the horde. They either had eagle wings or elytra wings on their backs. When they saw that the Arcana Masters were trying to escape, they immediately flapped their wings and flew into the sky, surrounding them tightly. A few dazzling arcana spells swept past, and a dozen black and red beasts fell from the sky, wailing in pain. However, the Arcanists who were surrounded could not break out of the encirclement. In the end, their external shields were broken, and after a series of fierce tearing and biting, they were cut into pieces, turning into bloody corpses. Only at this moment did the floating city finally react. A dozen arcane watchtowers circled around and suddenly descended from the clouds, pouring a terrifying torrent of arcane spells onto the most densely packed and closest areas of the swarm of mutated beasts. Naturally, the mutated beasts would not give up so easily. A large number of flying mutated beasts soared into the sky, quickly entangling with the arcane watchtowers. Arcanists might be very weak individually, unable to fight the mutated beasts head-on. But once they hid in the arcane watchtowers, with the support of the arcane facilities, their individual strength was instantly amplified more than 10 times. Even though there weren't many high-level Arcana Masters guarding the dozen or so Arcana Guard towers, the sturdy towers and the abundant Arcana techniques within them were still able to hold their own against the horde of mutated beasts. In an instant, in the sky, all kinds of energy light swept across the horizon, and corpses fell like rain. Xiaoho, who was hiding among the mutated beasts, did not care about the casualties of his subordinates, but he could not let them die here for nothing. Therefore, while the arcane watchtowers were slaughtering the mutated beasts, the earth trembled, the soil cracked, and 3 huge stone puppets, each more than 10 meters tall, drilled out from the ground. As soon as these stone puppets appeared, they raised their beehive-like stone heads, raised their arms high, and condensed a huge stone between their palms. Then, with a wave of their arms, they smashed the flying arcane watchtowers with a whoosh. One of the arcane watchtowers could not dodge in time and was hit by 3 huge stones at the same time, immediately swaying and falling from the sky. The mutated beasts on the ground that were being trampled miserably roared as they surrounded it, quickly drowning it in the black beast tide. The remaining arcane watchtowers were furious when they saw this. 4 of them circled down and kept attacking the beast that had piled up like a small mountain, trying to save their comrades. At the same time, more sentry towers released rapid lightning chains, which crazily struck at the 3 huge stone puppets. These 3 stone puppets were all at the pinnacle of Grade 2. Naturally, they could not be destroyed by mere energy lightning chains. The rocks on the surface of their bodies were scorched black, and many of them collapsed like mudslides. However, with a flash of yellow elemental light, a large amount of earth elemental energy flowed along their legs to the damaged parts of their bodies, quickly solidifying into a new layer of rock skin. As such, the three stone puppets were able to endure the attacks of the arcane watchtowers. The arcane watchtowers became even more anxious when they saw this. They actually hovered in the air and began to communicate with the floating city above, guiding the real arcane watchtowers to attack even more fiercely. Seeing such a great opportunity, how could Sieho let it go so easily? He suddenly drilled out of the soil beneath the arcane watchtowers, raised his head and roared, using a huge yellowish-brown light to cover the 4 arcane watchtowers. Gravity Ring. A gravity ring personally released by a Grade 4 Lesser Disaster Lord. The 4 arcane guard towers immediately began to tremble, and they began to slide down continuously. Seeing that the situation was bad, the arcanists inside hurriedly poured even more arcane energy into the floating rings at the base of the watchtowers. Only then did they barely manage to resist the powerful pull of gravity, preventing themselves from falling from the sky. The arcanists panicked when they suddenly discovered the figure of the Grade 4 Lesser Disaster Lord. They shook the watchtowers, doing their best to break free from the gravity ring's influence. At the same time, they unleashed one arcane attack after another, raining down on the enemy. However, just as the arcane watchtowers and the gravity ring were locked in a stalemate, a deep-colored fireball streaked across the sky and struck the watchtowers. This time, the arcane watchtowers could no longer maintain their stability. One by one, they spun and fell from the sky, black smoke rising from their bodies. Several thousand meters away, Grim, who had transformed into a tall, flaming man, slowly stepped onto the battlefield with heavy footsteps. Under the ferocious attacks of his fireballs, the arcane watchtowers could not escape his attack range in time. One by one, they were shot down from the sky. Seeing that the situation was not good, the last 2 remaining arcane watchtowers turned around and tried to escape back to the floating city, only to be punched by a mysterious guy who descended from the sky, wrapped in strange silver armor, one after another, and smashed them straight into the sky. Without the advantage of flying, once the arcane watchtowers fell to the ground, they would no longer be able to break free from the encirclement of the mutated beasts. Seeing that his 2 allies were quite capable and did not play any tricks, the Lesser Disaster Lord nodded in satisfaction. He had come here to reap the lives and souls of the floating city. How could he allow himself to be trapped on the ground? The Lesser Disaster Lord stood proudly on the ground, and for the first time, he began to use the earth elemental energy in his body. As he opened his mouth, all the earth elemental energy in the ground began to gather around his body. In the next second, a thick stone pillar shot up into the sky, carrying the evil hoof up into the sky. The mutated beasts that could fly flapped their wings, circling around the stone pillars as they quickly flew above the clouds. Even more mutated beasts leaped up and used their sharp claws to climb onto the stone pillars, fighting to be the first to charge towards the floating city. Chapter 11:13. When the mutated beasts appeared on the floating city, the arcanists were already prepared for battle. Rows of arcana puppets formed a dense phalanx, blocking the arcanists' path. They came in all kinds of shapes and sizes, covering most of the positions on the battlefield. At the very front was a row of especially tall and sturdy arcana puppets. Most of them were already 10 meters tall. Compared to other puppets, their bodies were almost completely covered in metal components, and they were especially thick and sturdy. The surface of the metal components was etched with all kinds of strange magic patterns and arcane spells. The surging arcane energy in their bodies seeped through the gaps between the components, condensing into an arcane barrier on the surface of their bodies. The sturdiness of red copper, coupled with the good magic conductivity of magic silver, made them powerful war puppets that cultivated both magic and martial arts. Their weapons were the huge metal fists and the terrifying giant legs that were 2 meters thick. When they stood in a row and charged at the enemy, the whole world would tremble and tremble. Behind the war puppets were rows of 3-meter-tall battle puppets that were carved and polished to look like steel knights. They were like human knights wearing full sets of steel armor, holding 2 steel swords that were 1.5 meters long in their hands. They followed closely behind the war puppets, waving the swords in their hands as if they were flying. It was obvious that they were playing the role of a guerrilla. Behind the steel guards were a large number of ordinary arcana puppets. Although they were slightly weaker in melee combat, they all had the strange ability to release energy balls. Therefore, they played the role of long-range attackers in the team. As for the human arcanists, they all hid in their arcana towers, where they controlled the powerful arcana facilities and created a storm of lightning above the battlefield. On a battlefield like this, there was almost no space for arcana apprentices to use their abilities. Therefore, they were all sent to the inner ring of the floating city and concentrated there for protection. At the beginning, there were very few mutated beasts that charged up the floating city, and they couldn't break through the strong defense line formed by the arcane puppets at all. One aberrant beast after another charged forward, but before they touched the war puppets in the first row, they were blown into smithereens by the raining energy balls. But as time went on, more and more mutated beasts rushed up the stone pillars to the floating city. Even the sky was occupied by mutated beasts of black and red color, roaring as they flew. There was a dull thud. The evil hoof appeared in front of the arcane puppet's defensive line with a powerful aura. It looked at the puppets and raised its body, its lotus petal-shaped mouth trembling rapidly. It was as if a trumpeter had sounded the charge horn. More and more mutated beasts immediately roared and charged at the puppet defense line. The lightning storm that had long gathered at the front lines of the battlefield erupted. Thick bolts of lightning struck down, electrifying the aberrant beasts one after another. Green smoke rose from their bodies, and their life energy dropped rapidly. But the aberrant beasts were obviously not afraid of death. They were like a flood that had opened the floodgates, crossing the minefield and colliding head-on with the first row of war puppets. The war puppets that were like steel giants stood still, kicking and punching, forcibly cutting the black torrent into even finer black lines. The aberrant beasts that broke through the war puppets immediately tangled with the steel guards. Dong, dong, dong. Boom, boom, boom. Kacha, kacha, kacha. All kinds of strange sounds intertwined at the front lines of the battlefield, deafening, and the smell of blood rose to the sky. With a dull thud, Grim stepped out of an exploding ring of flames, ignoring the few aberrant beasts that had been burnt to ashes beside him. He focused his eyes and peered at the battlefield from afar. At this time, the battle was mainly concentrated in the outer ring. A large number of arcanists sent by the floating city, with the help of the arcane puppets and arcane towers, forcibly blocked the aberrant beasts outside. Within his field of vision, there was a battlefield of blood and flesh flying everywhere. There were death zones overflowing with energy everywhere. On the contrary, the inner ring of the floating city was unusually quiet. What do you think? Let's charge into the inner ring and kill some people while we're at it, shall we? A few hundred meters away from Grim, Wizard Holly, who was wrapped in his ectoplasm armor, had just set foot on the surface of the floating city. Behind the two of them, Chiolisha had used some unknown method to hide herself and was also secretly peeking at the battlefield. The Arcanist line of defense can only stop the aberrant beasts, not us. However, we don't know anything about the situation inside. If we just charge in like this, it'll be easy for us to be ambushed by the Arcanists. Grim thought for a moment and rejected Wizard Holly's suggestion. Then what you're saying is, Wizard Holly said hesitantly, help Xie Hoof open up a path in the line of defense and let some of the aberrant beasts into the inner ring. Then we'll sneak in and do something big. This way, with the aberrant beasts distracting us, the chances of us being ambushed will be much lower. All right, we'll do as you say. After a simple discussion, the two extremely daring magi immediately began to move. When it came to overcoming difficulties, Wizard Holly, who had the ectoplasm armor, was much easier to deal with than Grimm. He mixed in with the group of aberrant beasts and continued to advance forward. Before the lightning could even get close to his body, it was scattered into electrical energy by the strange starlight. When he was about 100 meters away from a war puppet, he suddenly raised both of his hands and condensed a beam of light that was half a meter thick between his palms. In an instant, he shot it towards his opponent. Strangely, this beam of light actually penetrated the arcane barrier of the war puppet and shone directly on its huge, thick metal chest. Now, what kind of light is this? Why can I feel the energy aura it should have? Without the support of energy, what kind of harm can this light do? Just as Grimm was feeling puzzled, the seemingly harmless beam of light suddenly emitted specks of starlight and began to quickly corrode the metal body of the war puppet. He didn't know what kind of energy the starlight was made of, but it actually had a very strong corrosive effect on metal. Visible to the naked eye, the metal on the war puppet's chest was dissolved by the starlight like powder, peeling off layer by layer. A small pit quickly appeared. The arcanist controlling the war puppet in the arcane tower far away was the first to realize something was wrong. He immediately controlled the war puppet to move horizontally, trying to avoid this strange beam of light. However, the body of the war puppet was too big, and its movement could not compare to the beam of light in Wizard Holly's palm. Therefore, under the rapid corrosion of the starlight, the pit quickly collapsed, almost corroding through the 1 meter thick chest of the war puppet. Below the chest was the most important energy core of the war puppet. Once the arcane energy core was damaged, even if the other parts of the war puppet did not suffer much damage, it would still be a fatal blow. From then on, it would become a pile of useless copper and iron. Seeing that the situation was critical, the arcane tower in the distance suddenly shone brightly. A wild chain of lightning snaked across the battlefield for thousands of meters and struck towards Wizard Holly. Grimm frowned and pointed his finger. Wildfire elements quickly gathered on the surface of Wizard Holly's body, trying to condense into a lava shield to block the damage. However, under the illumination of the starlight from Wizard Holly's ectoplasmic armor, the lava shield suddenly dissipated into a sea of fire before it could even form. It had lost its defensive ability. Wizard Holly's starlight seemed to attack indiscriminately. Even the buffs of his allies could be blocked outside. Just when Grimm and Wizard Holly were about to take this violent attack from the arcane tower, a thick stone pillar rose up from the center of the battlefield, blocking the path of the wild chain of lightning. Crack! Following a loud explosion, the wild chain of lightning turned the thick stone pillar into a bright red, and the powerful energy that could not be released blew it into pieces. It was Evil Hoof. It was the one who blocked that attack. Grimm's burning eyes swept over. That Evil Hoof emerged from the group of alienated beasts and roared ferociously. Attack! Attack! Keep attacking. Just focus on attacking that big guy. I'll block the rest for you. If you can take it down, I'll give you a lot of resources. You mean what you say? Watch me. Wizard Holly was overjoyed, and the thick beam of light between his palms became more and more intense. Grimm sneered and continued to stride forward. As he moved forward, he shot out dark and restrained fireballs from his hands. These fireballs were obviously different from normal witchcraft fireballs. They contained a strong and strange power of the law of fire. Even if it was a lifeless arcane puppet, it would still feel a strange pain when hit by a fireball like this. Those rank 1 arcane puppets were engulfed by the fireballs, and the metal rings around them would immediately melt. Therefore, Grimm's blazing fireballs were like cannonballs exploding in the formation of arcane puppets, blowing them to the ground one by one. It was like the autumn wind sweeping away the fallen leaves. Even those rank 2 steel guards could not withstand the bombardment of 2 or 3 blazing fireballs. Therefore, under Grimm's crazy bombardment, a path of fire appeared through the puppet's defensive line. Just as the arcanists were frantically trying to deploy arcane puppets from other regions to fill in the gaps, a series of explosions suddenly rang out from within the 10-meter-tall war puppet's body. Countless metal parts and components on its body were blasted away. It swayed its huge body, staggered 2 steps forward, and finally fell to the ground on its back. When its heavy body fell, it even crushed the ground that had been strengthened by hundreds of arcane spells. The fall of the war puppet also opened a path to the inner ring on the main battlefield that stretched for several kilometers. Countless aberrant beasts trampled over its remains, traversing the path of flames and charging unstoppably towards the inner ring of the floating city. Chapter 11:14. The defensive line had been breached. Not only did this give the floating city a hole in the defensive line, it also caused the entire battle to go out of control. Today's battle was not really a battle of attack and defense. The goal of victory was to wipe out the enemy's forces. It was a battle of slaughter. The mutated beasts that were eager to break through the defensive line were like a pack of hungry wolves. They did not have the time and energy to fight with the shepherd dogs. Once they found a hole in the sheepfold, they would swarm in and vent their ferocity and cruelty on the trembling lambs. Who were the lambs? The Arcana apprentices that were large in number but did not have enough power to protect themselves. After breaking through the defensive line, the mutated beast still had to break through the numerous Arcana towers. If it were a group of slightly more rational attackers, they would have taken out these Arcana towers one by one in order to reduce the casualties of the team. However, this group of mutated beasts could not be estimated with common sense. They did not have the thought of attacking the city or seizing the flag. Their minds were only filled with blood, slaughter, and delicious souls. Therefore, the swarm of mutated beasts swarmed over and paved a path of blood between the narrow and rugged Arcana towers, extending all the way to the inner ring of the floating city. At this point, the mutated beasts were no longer in the mood to fight against the cold and hard Arcana towers. Instead, they rushed into the Arcana facilities one after another, using their terrifying numbers and powerful individual strength to slaughter and harvest the lives and souls of the middle-rank and low-rank arcanists and apprentices. Grimm and the other two were not interested in helping the evil hooves to continue fighting. They followed the torrent into the inner ring and began to crazily plunder. At this time, no one would gather together and affect their time to plunder resources and knowledge. Therefore, the three wizards naturally split up. Grimm exited his flame giant form and returned to his human form. Wrapped in a layer of golden flames, his figure became invisible. He leisurely followed the group of mutated beasts, continuing to advance into the inner ring of the floating city. Along the way, they saw many strangely shaped Arcana facilities, and they could detect the auras of a large number of arcanists. However, Grimm did not seem to notice them at all. He simply ignored them and headed straight for the tallest arcane palace in the inner ring of the floating city. Since he had come to this world of arcane magic, it would be a waste for him to risk his life a few times if he did not search for some necessary knowledge and resources. And in the floating city, where was the most likely place to store the profound Arcana knowledge? Of course, it was the most central and eye-catching Arcana palace. Therefore, relying on the stealth ability of the Law of Fire, Grimm broke through the tight blockade formed by the Arcana towers and passed by many Arcana facilities that looked like libraries and laboratories. He even stopped in his tracks and watched as a group of arcanists directed a large number of arcane puppets towards the front lines. These Arcana puppets were all very new. Grimm could even see signs of shoddy workmanship and hasty work on them. From this, it could be seen that the defensive power of the floating city he was in had been squeezed to a certain limit and was operating in overload. This was undoubtedly good news for Grimm. The power of the floating city was so obvious that it did not seem to be some kind of disguise. This also meant that in the following battles and breakthroughs, it was unlikely that they would encounter any fatal traps. And this was also the only thing that Grimm was worried about. Buildings were being torn down one after another. The sky was filled with strange monsters with black wings and crocodiles' heads. They screamed shrilly and shuttled back and forth between the bright energy rays of the Arcana towers. Every time they saw an arcanist or an apprentice, They would dive down with shrill screams and grab the enemy into the sky with a series of violent explosions. Then, they would tear the enemy into pieces of bloody meat and devour them alive. On the ground, all kinds of strange black and red, mutated beasts roamed around. Almost every Arcana building was surrounded by a large group of monsters. After they tore apart the defensive Arcana puppets, they charged into the buildings. Soon, all kinds of heart-wrenching screams came from inside. However, these screams would stop very quickly. Then, all kinds of scary sounds of chewing and swallowing could be heard. Grimm strolled leisurely between the battlefields and slaughterhouses. He could see very clearly that transparent blue light spots were floating out from various parts of the floating city. They circled in the air for a while and slowly floated towards where Evil Hoof's aura was. He did not know what method Evil Hoof used to cut off the path of these souls to return to the Mother Spirit River. However, he could guess that it must have something to do with the use of rule power. Otherwise, Grimm could not imagine what kind of witchcraft or spell could be so powerful that it could interfere with the operation of the plane's laws in such a large area. According to the agreement, the life, energy, and souls that were harvested belonged to Evil Hoof. Therefore, Grimm only observed silently for a while and did not try to intercept any of the Arcanist souls. Wizard Holly and Chiolisha had already scattered. Only an idiot would not rush to plunder resources and treasures here. Although the three of them had formed a team, on this floating city that was full of treasures, no one was willing to follow behind another strong Arcanist and eat the leftovers. Therefore, Grimm was not surprised at all when they left. However, Grimm knew in his heart that their actions were unwise. After all, apart from the normal Arcanists in the floating city, there was also a fifth circle Grand Arcanist. However, it was not the Grand Arcanist named for that Grimm was afraid of, but another terrifying enemy, the Lesser Lord of Calamity, Siehoof. After working together to rush into the floating city, the relationship between the two sides had changed drastically. Evil Hoof's words about working together to deal with the Fifth Circle Grand Arcanist could be true. Perhaps in Evil Hoof's eyes, a few scattered rank 4 wizards were easier to kill than a Fifth Circle Grand Arcanist. Therefore, after parting ways with Wizard Holly and Chiolisha, Grimm remained invisible and roamed around the battlefield. He did not go out to steal any resources or treasures. His purpose was to not let Evil Hoof know his location, so as to avoid unnecessary covetous thoughts. At a crossroad leading to the Inner Circle Arcana Palace, 3/4 Circle Arcanists stood in a triangular formation, surrounded by a circle of arcane puppets of different shapes, silently guarding this place. In front of them, hundreds of mutant beasts were launching waves of fierce attacks. The thick layers of corpses on the periphery of the battlefield were enough to show the intensity and bloodiness of the battle here. The 3 Arcanists surrounded a spell pool with a diameter of 10 meters. The walls of the pool were made of white, gray stones, and the purest arcane energy flowed in it. The 4 walls of the spell pool were covered with all kinds of strange patterns and arcane runes. From time to time, they would vibrate with the arcane energy in the pool, overflowing with dazzling arcane light. One had to admit that the spell pool was one of the greatest arcane inventions of the Arcane Kingdom. Although the spell pool looked inconspicuous, it was one of the most secure centers of the entire floating city. Usually, the tens of thousands of Arcanists and apprentices in the floating city would come to the spell pool to meditate in their spare time and store part of their mental power into the spell pool, condensing arcana models and storing them there. In this way, as long as they were still in the Arcane Secret Network, they could use their usual stored arcane models from the spell pool at any time and anywhere. Moreover, to a certain extent, the Inner Arcane Secret Network allowed them to borrow or overdraft some arcane models. This also meant that once the Arcanists stepped onto the battlefield, they would be able to use the least amount of mental energy to summon high-level arcana spell models, and they would be able to cast them instantaneously. Therefore, the 3 Arcanists stood with their backs against the spell pool. Every time they waved their arcane scepters, they would be able to shoot out a terrifyingly powerful and fast high-level arcane spell. It was thanks to their continuous supply of high-level arcane spells that the arcane puppets on the periphery could resist the frenzied siege of hundreds of mutant beasts with such a small number. However, just when the battle was at its most intense and ferocious, the floating city suddenly trembled slightly. The arcane barrier that appeared on the arcane towers and facilities shook a few times, and then mysteriously disappeared. The spell pool that the 3 level 4 arcanists guarded also made a strange cracking sound, and a huge crack appeared on the wall of the spell pool. A huge amount of arcane energy spurted out from the crack, forming a beautiful magic rainbow above the spell pool. Looking around the entire floating city, they were not the only area that had an accident. All the arcane towers and spell pools had collapsed at the same time. Such a terrible scene immediately made the level 4 arcanists' expressions change abruptly, and one of them even exclaimed out loud, "Damn it, something happened to the energy core." The energy core was the energy center of the floating city. Once there was an accident, the entire floating city's arcane energy supply would have a big problem. In the best-case scenario, the arcane buildings everywhere would lose their energy supply and lose their basic functions. In the worst-case scenario, the floating city would lose its ability to float and eventually fall to the ground. Therefore, as soon as they sensed the disappearance of the arcane barrier, the arcanists couldn't help but panic. Without the arcane barrier, the mana pool, and the spell pool, how are they going to defend against the endless enemies from afar? Chapter 11:15. A large number of terrifying earth spears rose from the ground and quickly overturned where the 3/4 ring arcanists were. An arcana master's agonized howl could be heard amidst the thick smoke that filled the air. When the dust and stone fragments dispersed, only 2 arcanists were still intact around the magic pool that stood like a forest of spears. The other arcanist had half of his body pierced through by a thick earth spear, and he was hung high up in the air. The 2 arcanists who had escaped death were still covered in the glow of their arcana shields. However, the arcana shields had also been severely challenged by the fierce attack just now. Hence, the light on the surface of the arcana shields was dim and seemed to be on the verge of breaking. The 4th ring arcana master wearing the earth spear spikes obviously hadn't experienced much tempering, and his constitution was shockingly low. Therefore, before his 2 companions could save him, he was already on the verge of death. This was the result of arcanists focusing too much on accumulating arcane knowledge and neglecting constitution. If it was a normal wizard, even a grade 3 wizard, they would not have been killed so easily by Siahoof. As the ground shook, Siahoof emerged from the ground as if he was walking on water. The black scales on his body were covered in large scorch marks, as if he had just gone through a terrifying energy explosion. Judging from the way he had appeared, the other 2 arcanists immediately realized what had happened. You're the one who destroyed the energy core underground." They roared angrily and waved their arcane scepters, pointing at Siahoof. However, after a gust of cold wind, nothing happened. There were no rays of light, no energy balls, not even a drop of arcane energy appeared. The expressions of the 2/4 ring arcanists changed again. Only then did they realize that because of the explosion of the energy core underground, the spell pool behind them had completely lost its effect. For thousands of years, arcanists had gotten used to relying on arcane facilities to fight. If they ran out of arcane energy, they would borrow it from the mana pool. If they ran out of arcane spells, they would borrow it from the spell pool. No matter what kind of enemy they faced, as long as the Arcana Master's Arcana techniques were still working, they would be able to use all sorts of Arcana techniques to torture them to death. However, now that the mana pool had been destroyed, the spell pool had also been destroyed. This made the Arcanists who had relied on them to fight all year round really feel a little uncomfortable. Just as the 2 Arcana Masters hesitated for a moment, Siahoof's figure flashed and appeared next to one of them. The yellow mist corroded through the Arcana shield, and a petrifying ray struck the Arcana Master's body. The Arcana Master then quickly fled the battlefield, evading the Arcana Master's desperate counterattack. The Arcana Master roared angrily, waving his staff and continuing to chase after Siahuf. Unfortunately, as the power of petrification spread rapidly in his body, he was paralyzed and petrified into a greenish-gray humanoid statue in less than 3 seconds. This was all caused by the weak constitution of Arcana Masters. If their physiques were a little stronger and their magic resistance was a little higher, they would be able to delay the onset of the power of petrification, at least giving him some time to save himself or escape. But now, the remaining fourth ring Arcana Master lost all confidence in being able to defeat this lesser Lord of Calamity that could appear and disappear unpredictably. If the energy core was fine, he would have an endless supply of magic power, an endless supply of arcana techniques, and a powerful arcana barrier to protect himself. He would not be afraid of an enemy of the same level as him. Unfortunately, there were not so many ifs in this world. Without the support of external objects, Arcana Masters lacked battle techniques, physical training, and willpower. These weaknesses were all exposed. The ferocious monster tore off the corpse of the Arcanist hanging on the stone spear and started munching on it. It sniffed and pulled out a dark blue soul shadow from the corpse. The soul shadow was sucked into the monster's body as if it was taking drugs. Only then did the monster let out a strange, yet satisfied, growl. If one died at the hands of Siahuf, not only would their corpses become food for the Arcana Master, but even their souls would not be able to find peace. Upon seeing this, the remaining Arcana Master's consciousness quickly collapsed. He pulled out a bunch of strange-looking arcana tools and threw them at Siahuf. Then, he began to chant the password for the teleportation spell in a trembling voice. Without the support of the spell pool, he could not use any of his instant cast arcana techniques. He could only rely on his own strength to cast arcana techniques. That was why it took him a full 7 seconds to barely cast a teleportation gate, which he could easily open in the past. But how could Siahuf, who already saw him as a meal on his plate, let him escape? Siahuf stood upright, his menacing, lotus petal-shaped mouth parts trembling rapidly in the direction of the portal. As strange spatial ripples spread across the portal, the black mirror-like portal began to tremble violently. The Arcana Master was shocked. He quickly injected his willpower into the portal to prevent it from collapsing. Among the arcana tools he had thrown out, there were silver statues that could turn into exquisite arcana puppets, arcana scrolls that emitted rays of silver light, and some strange fruits that could quickly turn into spiritual shockwaves. Finally, with the help of these miscellaneous arcana tools, he managed to stall Siahuf for 3 seconds. Fortunately, he managed to escape the scene and hide in one of the arcana towers. After killing and devouring the flesh and souls of 2 fourth ring Arcana Masters, Siahuf was immediately energized. Even the violent energy shockwaves on his body had recovered a lot. Thus, under his command, a large group of mutated beasts broke through the broken spell pool and pounced toward the Arcana Hall behind. There, he sensed the aura of the 5th ring Great Arcana Master. After watching the battle between Siahuf and the other Arcana Masters, Grimm felt agitated and uneasy. In terms of vitality and combat ability, Siahuf was far superior to him. Even if he used all his strength, it would be impossible for him to defeat such an opponent. On the contrary, the chances of him dying were as high as 39%. However, if Grimm wanted to escape, it would be difficult for Siahuf to stop him. In Grimm's mind, the information that the AI chip had gathered based on the shockwaves from the battle was extremely eye-catching. Siahuf, Lesser Lord of Calamity, Rank 4, Earth Element. Stats: Strength 31, Vitality 46, Agility 36, Spirit 42. Mastered Skills: All mid to high-rank Earth Element abilities. Earth Mist Erosion, Rank 4. Petrification Ray, Rank 4. Ring of Gravity, Rank 4. Arcana Master, 4th Ring. Strength, Attribute Unknown. Stats: Strength 8, Vitality 14, Agility 6, Spirit 43. Abilities: mastery of arcana techniques, puppet creation, affinity with arcana. The difference in their basic strength was so great that it was like the difference between heaven and earth. With such a difference in strength, it was no wonder that the arcana masters were as fragile as paper in front of Siahuf once they lost the support of arcane facilities, such as the Arcana Tower, the Mana Pool, and the Spell Pool. Grimm clearly disagreed with the arcana masters who relied heavily on external resources. As a spellcaster, the necessary research and experiments were necessary, but they could not give up on the tempering of the body and the sharpening of the will to fight. In the sorcerer world, all sorcerers must prioritize the improvement of their combat power. Only when their own combat power could guarantee their own safety would they spend a certain amount of effort and resources on research that they were interested in. Otherwise, what was the use of research if they lost their lives? That was why the arcana masters living in the Morian plane were far more thorough in their research and pursuit of the truth than the sorcerers. Unfortunately, they were good at research but bad at protecting themselves. When the entire arcane kingdom was in danger, there was almost no one who could stand up and turn the tide. Grimm could only sympathize with them. After all, the multiverse was a world of violent turbulence. If they wanted to steadily climb the ladder of technology, occupy territory, and crush their opponents with technology that was far superior to theirs. Such an idea was beautiful, but it was unrealistic. Instead, it was better to focus on pragmatism and individual strength, like the sorcerers. They concentrated most of the resources in the hands of a few sorcerers and piled up a super strong force that would make foreign enemies feel awe. Only in this way could they restrain the enemy's desire to pounce on them and fight for a certain development and reproduction opportunity for their own camp and successors. The reason why the sorcerer world was able to stand firm in the world of many powerful races was inextricably linked to the three great rank 9 sorcerers. Unfortunately for the Arcane Kingdom, the 2 Arcane Emperors had only reached rank 8. Such strength was obviously not enough to scare away those greedy and cruel enemies. Grimm slowly stepped forward and jumped into the broken spell pool. He used the chip to scan the strange runes etched on the wall of the pool. After making sure that nothing was missed, he got out, took a look at the arcane palace in the distance, turned around, and walked in another direction. There were too many places in the entire floating city that were worth a trip. There was no need for him to squeeze with Siahuf. If he guessed correctly, Siahuf should be heading straight for the rank 5 Arcanist. Although the two sides had agreed on the priority of dividing the spoils after killing the rank 5 Arcanist, the agreement itself was absurd. If the 3 sorcerers really helped Siahuf kill the rank 5 Arcanist, perhaps it wouldn't be the division of the spoils, but a new battle would break out. Chapter 11:16. Auspicious View Garden, Floating City. The flames of war had spread to every corner of the city. However, just as the mutant beasts and the Arcanists were entangled with each other, 2 strange figures slowly appeared in the sky. One was a man, tall and sturdy, covered with short, black, brown hair, with a wolf's head on his neck. The other one was a petite fox girl with a gentle figure. She had a furry red tail that trailed behind her, making her look exceptionally eye-catching. Hee, I didn't expect this place to be breached by the mutant beast just half a day later. What should we do, Ruth? Where should we go first? The werewolf spoke. While speaking, this werewolf fiercely scanned the battlefield with his ferocious, scarlet eyes. A fierce, domineering, and oppressive aura was unmistakable. Why are you afraid? Didn't we already find out before coming here? The one who invaded here is that bastard Siahoi. Based on its nature, it was definitely alone and reckless. We just need to follow him and take advantage of the fiercest battle between him and the Grand Arcanist. The fox girl had a fox's head on her neck with sharp teeth. Although her words were fierce, there was an indescribable charm and tenderness in her big eyes. Especially on her forehead, a crescent-shaped jasper gem slightly emitted a strange light. You think I'm afraid of Siahoi? If that guy wasn't so good at escaping, I would have broken his neck last time. This time, you just wait for a good show. See how I'm going to deal with that guy who likes to dig around underground." After saying that, the werewolf raised his nose and fiercely sniffed. A strange look appeared on the black wolf's face. No, no. Other than that Siehoi, why do I smell the stench of those evil sorcerers here? Damn it, did Siehoi join forces with the sorcerers? Hee, that guy Siehoi would never sincerely join forces with anyone. In my opinion, he must have used some tricks to trick a few sorcerers to help him, and then wait until the matter is done before taking the opportunity to eat them. This is his usual trick. The fox girl curled her lips in disdain. So, who should we kill first? Are you an evil hoof or a wizard? At the mention of slaughter, the werewolf's muscles swelled up even more, and even his body grew a bit larger than before. Let's kill the wizards first, so that they don't interfere when we fight evil hoof later. Fox girl Ruth was obviously not a good person, so she made up her mind immediately. Follow me. I've already locked onto the stench of a magus. The werewolf opened his mouth full of sharp teeth and licked his lips. Then, he took the lead and charged into the sky. Meanwhile, the vixen's fox tail swayed behind her, and her entire body became a lot more hazy and illusory. She turned into a shadow and followed closely behind her werewolf companion, hurriedly pouncing toward a certain arcane building in the center of the floating city. The one they chose was none other than Wizard Holly. It couldn't be helped. Ever since they entered the inner ring of the floating city, Grim and Shiolisha had not revealed themselves. They had completely concealed their auras. It was no wonder that the two orcs found Holly, who was madly attacking a puppet factory, as soon as they appeared. This was a puppet factory full of high-tech aura. On rows of crystal lathes, there were nearly 100 semi-finished arcane puppets lying on their backs. Each crystal lathe was a small control station that could accommodate 3 arcane apprentices working at the same time. Their task was to etch the necessary arcane runes on the surface of the metal parts of the arcane puppets. Depending on the proficiency of the arcana apprentices, a puppet factory could produce 10 to 15 Moa I standard battle puppets or 20 to 25 Sophia, 3 general-purpose puppets every day. They were all public property of the Floating Cities Arcanist Association. Unfortunately, due to the problem with the energy core of the Floating City, this puppet factory also lost the support of arcane energy and could not continue to work. When Wizard Holly found this place and wanted to break in, he was surrounded by the arcane guards. As for the 5 arcanists and 70 arcane apprentices who were trapped in the factory, although they were also doing their best to attack the 3-meter-tall elemental construct, it was obvious that they could not pose any threat to the enemy. Just when Wizard Holly used brute force to take down a few high-grade arcane puppets and was about to rush in and plunder to his heart's content, he suddenly stopped and turned around to look at the path he came from. In his vision, a ferocious wolf head was rapidly expanding, accompanied by 10 frightening claws that flashed with a cold light. There's an enemy. Before Wizard Hori could finish his thought, his body, which was covered in his ectoplasm armor, started to creak as the claws of the 10 wolves scratched him. The other party opened its huge, wide mouth and ruthlessly bit towards Wizard Helly's slightly slender neck. As the huge mouth opened and closed, dark gray saliva flowed out from the gaps between the messy and sharp teeth, emitting a strong, sour smell. This sudden attack caused Holly to be a little flustered. After all, he was only a magic puppet master whose profession was to create puppets. Although he had strong, close, and long-range combat abilities, compared to a professional fighter, he was still a lot weaker. Moreover, this werewolf's attack was a little too ferocious. From the time Holly sensed the alarm spell formation was triggered to the time he turned around to face the battle, only 3 short seconds had passed. However, the werewolf had already traversed a distance of almost 500 meters and appeared directly in front of him. Moreover, the other party did not have the slightest intention of negotiating. The moment it appeared, it directly attacked with a deadly blow. Holly's elemental armor was fused with a large amount of astral matter. It was not known for its physical defense, but it was best for its magic resistance and magic disturbance properties. Therefore, under the fierce bite of the werewolf's huge mouth, the metal armor that was as thick as 4 fingers actually started to twist and deform. It looked like it was going to be bitten through in one bite. The sharp blades on the werewolf's left and right front claws had already sunk deep into the armor. With the great force of tearing, 10 terrifying claw marks were left on the surface of the armor. Holly felt the intense pain from his body and the terrifying power crushing down on him. The fear and deep fear in his heart instantly reached the peak of his emotions, unable to go any further. Following his ear-piercing scream of fear, a majestic pillar of starlight descended from the sky, enveloping himself and the werewolf at the same time. The starlight, which was soaked in dense, killing intent, circled around the werewolf's sturdy body like countless fireflies. It ignored the other party's short, thick, and black fur, as well as the wild, surging energy, and disappeared into the werewolf's body like birds returning to the forest. As the starlight continuously entered, the scary werewolf that was crazily biting Holly couldn't help but let out a muffled groan. Between the glossy black fur, there was a silver glow, and the power of its attack was also slightly weaker than before. Go to hell! Wizard Holly, who was extremely frightened, clenched his fists and fiercely struck out, but the werewolf twisted its body and dodged it. Afterward, the werewolf's 2 thick hind legs gave a powerful kick on the ectoplasm armor, kicking both Holly and his armor away. Wizard Holly flew out in a straight line and heavily smashed into a stone wall. After leaving a deep hole on the wall, he bounced back and rolled a few times on the ground. The deep hole on the wall was deeply sunken, and the stone wall where he hit had already been smashed into mud. Around the hole were terrifying cracks that were as dense as spider webs. Wizard Holly struggled to crawl up from the ground, panting violently. The deep claw marks and bite marks on his body were flowing with purplish-black blood. However, under the illumination of the resplendent pillar of starlight, the wounds on the surface of the ectoplasm armor were also quickly healing and recovering. Following a rapid murmur, a beautiful silver-white starlight gathered between Wizard Holly's palms. More and more gathered, and the energy aura became stronger and stronger. However, Wizard Holly didn't care about this at all. His gaze was still fixed on that scary werewolf. That werewolf, on the other hand, used the momentum of the stomp to fly out lightly and landed on the ground 100 meters away. Its entire body was half crouched on the ground, its front slightly bent and its back slightly arched. Its 2 thick hind legs were ready to attack. Looking at its posture, it could unleash its strength at any time and attack Wizard Holly again. However, when the werewolf's ruthless gaze landed on the starlight in Wizard Holly's hand, its scarlet eyes couldn't help but slightly shrink. A faint trace of fear and anger appeared on its face. The starlight in its opponent's hand was too strange. It actually had the terrifying ability to ignore defense and magic resistance. Therefore, in that short exchange just now, Wizard Holly was at a huge disadvantage on the surface. Even his original body, which was hiding in the ectoplasm armor, was severely injured. On the other hand, the werewolf was completely unharmed. However, only that werewolf knew the truth. It was only a short 2 to 3 finger exchange, but that sinister and frightening starlight had actually caused quite a bit of damage to its internal organs. Therefore, it used the momentum to jump away. It looked like it was adjusting its posture, but it was actually trying to buy time for its body to recover. After all, the regenerative ability of the werewolf race's body was also abnormally terrifying. Werewolf, believer of the orc god. Wizard Holly's gaze swept across the werewolf's body and quickly identified its identity. As soon as he identified the werewolf's identity, his body slightly retreated. The starlight in his hand suddenly turned into a beautiful halo and slowly flowed in all directions. As expected, wherever the starlight went, 20 meters to the right of his body, a slim and petite figure suddenly appeared. Damn it, it really has a companion. Wizard Holly cursed in a low voice, his mouth full of blood. He waved his hand, and a ball of bright starlight fell from the sky, smashing towards the new enemy that had been washed out by the starlight. Hee hee, you wizards really have a lot of tricks up your sleeves. Fox Girl Ruth was naturally angry that her sneak attack didn't work. As she revealed her graceful and beautiful figure, she threw a flirtatious glance at Wizard Holly. At the same time, she raised her slender hand and propped up a blood-chi barrier to block the bombardment of the starlight. Behind her, her fox tail gently swayed. It seemed like she was seducing people with her seductive posture, but in secret, a dozen or so unremarkable fine hairs shot out from her foxtail. Chapter 11:17. If it had been anyone else, they might have fallen for the fox lady's charm. However, since Wizard Hiri dared to participate in this mission, he naturally had some good stuff on hand. As for wizards, the protection of their spiritual consciousness was undoubtedly the most important among all spellcasters. With the help of the psychic pin, Wizard Hiri and the others grunted and resisted the fox lady's charm. With a sweep of his spiritual consciousness, he discovered the other party's secret movements. Wizard Hiri raised his arm and covered his face with it. Puff, 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 strange sounds rang out, and more than 10 seemingly light and soft foxtail hairs pierced straight into the astral armor, almost half of it going in. Wizard Hiri was shocked. One had to know that his astral armor was condensed and solidified by his strong willpower and astral matter. This astral matter was good at disturbing magic, but it was not good at defense. However, as an astral matter, its basic toughness was far stronger than most of the metals in the material plane. Yet, these strange fox hairs could actually pierce through the astral armor that was far stronger than normal magic alloys. This was enough to prove that their sharpness and armor-piercing effects were not the least bit weaker than high-grade magic weapons. Wizard Hiri carefully guarded while slowly moving his body to avoid being caught in a pincer attack by the werewolf and the fox lady. He raised his right hand, which was covered in star armor, and gently wiped the wound on his left arm. Under the corrosion of the silver starlight, the foxtails immediately turned into powder and scattered down. At this time, the werewolf had already quickly healed his injuries and was eager to fight again. The two of you, wait a minute, the two of you. Seeing the opponent's stance, Wizard Holly hurriedly gathered the starlight to protect himself and yelled, "We don't have any enmity between us. There's no need to fight to the death, right? Kakik, there are two of us and only one of you. We're all at grade 4. Are you sure you can escape?" The werewolf laughed coldly. From his words, it seemed that he was not ashamed of fighting with numbers, but rather proud of it. Don't be too arrogant. I didn't come here alone. I also have companions here. Once I summon my companions and expand the battle needlessly, it won't do anyone any good. Wizard Holly continued to be cautious. Everyone is here to plunder resources and treasures. There's no need to leave so many good things behind. Instead, we're fighting to the death here. What you're saying seems to make sense. The vixen raised her pretty face as if she had been tempted by his words. Yes. This is the largest puppet factory in the floating city. I've already killed all the arcane guards inside, so I can give it to you now. That should be fine, right? Seeing that the war gen was still as fierce as before, Wizard Holly couldn't help but grit his teeth and threatened, "Don't forget, I'm also a rank 4 wizard. If you push me too far, I can still drag one of you down with me. You don't want to end up in a life and death struggle, do you?" Not bad. What you said makes sense. You can go now. Fox Girl Ruth nodded with a face full of smiles. She looked at Wizard Holly with eyes full of ridicule and disdain. What do you mean? Don't force me. Seeing the Fox Girl's unfriendly gaze, Wizard Holly couldn't help but increase his vigilance. Endless starlight rolled on the surface of the armor, making it thicker. However, just as he was crazily controlling the starlight, an inexplicable dizziness made his vision go black, and he almost fell straight to the ground. I've been hit. When did I get hit? That's right, wolf claws. Wizard Holly instantly understood everything. He raised his eyes and looked at the sharp claws and the wolf's mouth of that war gen. Sure enough, there were strands of black smoke lingering on them. It looked like it was filled with poison. Hee hee, now you know why we've been talking with you for so long, right? We've been waiting for you to be poisoned. Fall to the ground now." Following the vixen's signal, that war djinn violently jumped up. His whole body turned into a black lightning, and in an instant, he appeared next to Wizard Holly. This time, the war djinn had learned his lesson. He no longer fought head-on with Wizard Holly's sturdy armor. Instead, he quickly ran around Wizard Holly's body. While dodging the bombardment of his opponent's palm and the starlight falling from above, he used his cold, sharp claws to carve out terrifying, crisscrossing claw marks on his opponent's armor. As for that fox girl, she was faintly discernible on the outskirts of the battlefield. Every time she appeared, she would throw flirtatious glances at Wizard Holly or blow him a kiss. Then, before Wizard Holly could retaliate, she would giggle and disappear again. This was not some kind of infatuation on the battlefield. It was a natural ability of fox girls. With the continuous bewitching of humans and her natural charm, even if Wizard Holly had a powerful spirit pin to protect his soul, there was still a high chance of him being bewitched. With the tenacity of Wizard Holly's soul, even if Fox Girl Ruth used her full strength, she could only bewitch him with 2 or 3 fingers at most. Don't think that these 2 or 3 fingers would disappear in a flash, but they could still cause him a lot of damage. After all, Wizard Holly was currently on the battlefield, fighting a life-or-death battle with that war djinn. Every time he was bewitched, he would automatically disperse the starlight that he had gathered with great difficulty or reduce the thickness of his astral armor. This would greatly affect the situation of the battle. Under the Fox Girl's interference, Wizard Holly, who had the wolfsbane on his body acting up, made several fierce counterattacks, but they were all strangled into nothingness. Seeing that his defeat was right in front of him, Wizard Holly no longer dared to put on a brave front. He turned around and wanted to escape into the distance. Unfortunately, before he could even take 2 steps, the werewolf appeared in front of him in a flash, firmly blocking his path of escape. The fox girl giggled and appeared behind him. Her fox tail swung out a charming red mist, blocking his escape route. "I'll fight you to the death." At the juncture of life and death, Wizard Holly no longer thought about anything else. He roared and pounced towards that war djinn with his arms wide open. Boom! Amidst the terrifying sound of an earth-shattering explosion, the strange armor that was soaked in endless starlight suddenly burst out in all directions, exploding into a huge mushroom cloud on the spot. The wild explosive force left a huge, bottomless pit with a diameter of nearly 100 meters on the stone floor of the floating city. The endless starlight instantly filled the entire world. Wherever it went, the soil, rocks, grass, and iron pieces were all corroded by the starlight and became riddled with holes, no longer looking the same as before. The nearest puppet factory was also half destroyed by the force of the explosion. All the arcanists and arcane apprentices hiding inside were directly killed by the sprinkling of starlight. After a while, when the power of the starlight weakened, that war djinn and the fox girl Ruth once again gathered at the edge of the deep pit, whispering to each other in low voices. "Dead. No, he ran away. Damn. I knew he wouldn't be so heroic. Where did he run to? Don't worry, I still injected the wolfsbane into his body. I know exactly where he ran to. Come, follow me." The red and black figures quickly disappeared from where they stood. At the back of a building 1,000 meters away, Wizard Hiri was ejected from the void, covered in blood. As soon as he came out, he rolled on the ground and desperately took out all kinds of bottles and cans from his waist pouch, pouring them into his mouth with all his might. As he drank, he coughed violently. What he coughed out were purplish-black blood clots and broken internal organs. On his neck, 2 black teeth marks were clearly visible. The surrounding muscles were rotten and sour, and there was a huge swollen pustule. If it wasn't for the silver wizard robe on his body being too conspicuous, people might really have mistaken him for that strange guy with 2 heads. Damn. Those 2 bastards. Why did you come to me, of all people? Cough, cough, cough. Grim, Chiolisha, you all deserve to die. I sent out a distress signal for so long, and you didn't even show your faces. Even more deserve to die. If only one of you came, Those two bastards wouldn't dare to attack me so arrogantly. Bastards, you all deserve to die. The poison that the werewolf injected was clearly a little strange. Normal antidotes were completely ineffective against it. If this place was safe enough, and Wizard Hiri was given an alchemy laboratory, he might really be able to concoct a magic potion that could temporarily restrain the wolfsbane. Unfortunately, this was a foreign plain battlefield that was filled with blood and slaughter. As far as the eye could see, there were battles everywhere, and there was not a single quiet place for people to stay. Wanting to slowly analyze the wolfsbane in such a harsh environment and find a way to counteract, it was simply wishful thinking. Moreover, in his vague and vibrating spiritual sense, he could feel two familiar energy presences quickly approaching. He was afraid that in another 7 or 8 seconds, they would catch up. Just as Wizard Hiri's heart turned cold, and his heart was already filled with the thought of death, a huge shadow silently shrouded his body. When the fox girl and the werewolf arrived, they only saw blood all over the ground, but no trace of the human wizard. Damn, where is that wizard? Fox girl Ruth's eyes were slightly red, and her fierce gaze carefully swept around the surroundings. He was just here. I didn't sense the presence of teleportation. The werewolf landed on the ground, raised his nose, and fiercely sniffed. Wait, I smelled a strange shadow power. That wizard was taken away by a shadow creature. Damn, which bastard dares to steal our prey from our mouths? Chase. Even if we chase them to the ends of the earth, we will drag them out. Chapter 11:18. When the place became quiet again, a series of footsteps could be heard. The figure could not be seen, but a series of clear footprints suddenly appeared on the dirty blood stains on the ground. The footprints extended all the way to the place where Wizard Holly disappeared before stopping. A moment later, the golden flames that engulfed his body receded, revealing Grimm's young and sturdy body. He was wearing a red wizard robe inside and a black cloak on the outside. The hood was pulled up, covering his face. Only a few messy black hair could be seen sticking out of the opening. Grimm's fiery eye quickly scanned the area and quickly determined the strength of the people involved. Hiri, the werewolf, the fox girl, and the dark witch Shunny. As expected, Shunny did not really die. Instead, she chose to resurrect in this different plane. As a Tier 4 intermediate dark witch, her appearance had undoubtedly set off alarm bells for Grimm. This trip to the floating city would not be as smooth as he thought. His old enemy, the dark witch, had appeared, and now there were two unfamiliar followers of the beast god. If the lesser disaster overlord, Sief Fui, was added, there were more than 5 powerful beings from another world roaming around in the floating city, looking for hunting grounds and prey. Wizard Hiri's strength was not bad, but it was obvious that he was blinded by the benefits in front of him. At a time like this, he would rather work hard to gather resources than rob a prey that was full of rewards. It was because he did not understand this that he was kicked out of the list of competitors at the beginning of the war by his enemies. From the aura in front of him, it could be seen that Wizard Hiri had fallen into Shunny's hands. Grimm could roughly guess the reason why Shunny had kidnapped Holy. Shunny had already died once, and she had lost most of her magic tools and equipment. In addition, her new body would not be able to reach grade 4 in a short period of time, so her basic combat ability would definitely be greatly reduced. Therefore, Shunny did not dare to face Grimm at all. If she met Grimm, it would not be a matter of her killing him, but a matter of whether Grimm was willing to let her go. In order to kill Grimm and complete this mission, Shunny could only take the risk to find some helpers. Xiao was too useless. Cooperating with her would not be of any help to Xiani's combat power. That was why Shunny had set her sights on poor Wizard Holly. Although there was a contract between Grimm and Holy, when their lives were in the hands of others, it was obvious what Wizard Holy would choose. It seemed that the next time they met, Shunny and Holly would become his enemies. Grimm lowered his head and muttered to himself. Suddenly, he raised his head and looked at the sky not far away. Golden flames quickly spread to his entire body, causing him to disappear into thin air once again. There was a strange explosion of flames. A majestic body suddenly appeared in the sky, bent over to look at the flames of war burning everywhere on the floating city, and let out a deafening laugh. It was a terrifying abyssal demon. Its body was covered in a thick, thorny, and sturdy bronze armor. The armor was covered in huge scratches, almost covering the patterns on the surface of the armor. From the traces left behind, it could be seen that the depth of the scratches varied, and the time span could be as long as hundreds of years. When it stood high up in the sky and laughed maniacally, the muscles that were exposed outside the armor quickly swelled up as if they were inflated, making that simple and old-fashioned bronze armor a bit larger. Its indigo-colored skin was covered in all kinds of strange and twisted magic patterns, and the bulging muscles were as strong as iron ingots that had been tempered. Its appearance was cruel and terrifying. Its mouth was protruding forward, and it had a ferocious face similar to that of an ape or a dragon man. On its back, a pair of dark red tattered bat wings were swaying slightly, covered with sharp hooks. Every time it opened its mouth, it would spit out a translucent, sulfuric, poisonous flame from its sharp teeth, filling the entire space with a choking and pungent smell of sulfuric. A Tier 4 abyssal great demon, Grim hid in the dark with the help of the flames, silently observing the uninvited guest. It could be seen that the attack of the creatures of disaster on the floating city had ignited the flames of war and attracted the invaders from other worlds who were lurking nearby. This made the situation even more confusing, and it was difficult to predict what would happen next. But that was not the end. When the abyssal demon flapped its tattered demonic wings and dove into the battlefield in the distance, a streak of light flashed in the sky, attracting Grimm's attention once more. It was a strange pale white flame, and inside it hid a skeleton that was made of pure white bones. Looking at its white bones, its gums filled with magical gems, and the strange soul fire hidden behind the large rubies in its eye sockets, Grimm felt an indescribable chill in his heart. A lich, a terrifying grade 4 lich, and such a guy was probably strong enough to rule a complete, small bone plane. The lich hid in the cold death flames and flew over Grimm's head. When it passed by, its cold, merciless, and cruel soul fire swept past Grimm's hiding spot and stopped for a brief moment. As if sensing Grimm's soul presence that was not weaker than its own, the lich did not choose to fight him. Instead, it sneered and flew away. This was the biggest difference between spellcasters and combatants. Arrogant fellows like the fiends, calamities, and star beasts relied on their powerful strength to rush up and attack the moment they sensed the presence of an enemy. As for whether they could do it or not, that was another matter. On the other hand, spellcasters like liches and sorcerers were more rational and cunning. When encountering an enemy, especially one of the same rank, they would usually choose to avoid the battle and attack the weaker opponents. Only when the enemy revealed a relatively obvious weakness would they launch a fierce attack without any regard for their own safety. Once they sensed that they were in danger, they were usually the ones who were the most determined to escape. Hence, the lich had clearly sensed the strange law of fire around Grimm's body. However, after a brief consideration, it determined that it did not have the capital to take him down quickly, so it flew away without hesitation. From this, Grimm could deduce that it was also a fellow who had grasped a portion of the law of fire. Hence, it could see through the law of fire around Grimm's body. Although the abyssal demon was powerful, it could not detect Grimm's presence. Seeing the terrifying powerhouses that suddenly appeared, Grimm could not help but frown. This pool of water was getting murkier and murkier. Moreover, there were more and more predators mixed in. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to gain anything, the difficulty would undoubtedly be countless times greater than what he had originally estimated. Originally, with only Sieti and the three of them, Grimm was confident that he had the upper hand and could get what he wanted as long as he wanted. However, it seemed that he would have to pay a huge price to obtain anything. In particular, the dark, which was an unexploded bomb. If he was entangled by her, it would be extremely difficult for him to obtain anything. However, after thinking about it, Grimm could not help but feel proud. Calamities, followers of the beast god, demons, liches. Which one of them was not a famous tyrant in the dimension? Which one of them had not cultivated for hundreds of years to reach their current level? However, it had only been 200 years since he was born. Compared to them, the difference in strength was not that great. In fact, Grimm was extremely confident that he would be able to defeat a few of them. This clearly showed that Grimm's potential far exceeded theirs. Hence, in the face of these terrifying competitors, Grimm should not be discouraged. Instead, he should be proud of his own achievements. Grimm silently encouraged himself as he stealthily made his way to the inner ring of the floating city. He had to admit that the floating city was unusually large. The Arcana Masters had basically moved a gigantic city into the sky. Even Grimm could not help but be secretly impressed by them for being able to achieve such a great achievement that was almost miraculous. To be honest, if Grimm's soul hadn't been born in the wizard world, but in the arcane kingdom, he would have become a great arcanist by now. After all, the advancement in the arcane kingdom depended more on the level of one's own arcane knowledge, unlike the sorcerers who set strict and fixed standards for each rank. Therefore, the arcanists in the arcane kingdom rarely tempered their bodies, and even their mental strength was much weaker than the sorcerers of the same rank. Once these people were stripped of their arcane towers and arcane facilities, they were as fragile as a bunch of little white rabbits in front of the sorcerers of the same rank. Grimm concealed himself and wandered on the empty streets of the floating city. Some of the mutated beasts that were roaming all over the place ran past him, knocking down and destroying many shops and shops along the way. Whenever they found the arcanists guarding the arcane facilities, the mutated beasts would shriek and gather together to besiege them. This also caused the floating city to be set ablaze everywhere, and the sounds of houses collapsing and the roars of fighting could be heard everywhere. At that moment, Grimm saw the great demon of the abyss again. The great demon of the abyss was madly fighting with two arcane towers. Chapter 11:19. The battle was exceptionally bitter and also exceptionally bloody. Like a crazy wild boar, the abyssal archdemon completely ignored the dense and ferocious arcana attacks of the arcana towers. In the torrent of arcana spells that were as dazzling as fireworks, he knocked down one beautiful and magnificent art palace after another. The arcane apprentices hiding in the arcane towers were affected by the terrifying aura of fear. They all scattered in all directions, then were cut down by the great demon with its giant beheading sword. At the climax of the massacre, the great demon would randomly grab an arcana apprentice and throw him into his mouth. As soon as the sharp teeth closed, the shrill screams came to an abrupt end, and only the cracking sounds of bones and flesh could be heard. The level 4 arcanists hiding in the arcane towers were dumbfounded when they saw this. They all controlled the arcane towers to charge down from the sky, using the ferocious arcane torrent to engulf the great demon. However, before they could return to the sky, the great demon suddenly appeared behind the arcane towers with a loud bang, waving its giant beheading sword and slashing at the arcane barrier outside the arcane tower. The arcane towers that were attacked shook violently, and the great demon used its unparalleled brute force to forcefully smash them down to the ground. Although the body of the fallen arcane tower was not damaged at all and could still attack fiercely, it had lost its original flexibility and mobility. It could only stay in place and bitterly support the constantly shaking and rippling arcane barrier. Grimm, who was hiding in the dark, could not help but frown when he saw this. Originally, he had admired the arcana tower that the arcanist had built, but now it seemed that it had its own shortcomings. First of all, the biggest shortcoming was the lack of space. The wizards had the Wizard's Pagoda, and the arcanists had the arcane tower. In comparison, the arcane tower could fly into the sky, burrow into the ground, and change its position at will. This was much better than the Wizard's Pagoda. However, in order to be able to fly into the sky, the arcane tower reduced its weight multiple times during its basic construction. Most of the wizard's pagoda's body was made of stones with special magical attributes, which gave it both physical and magical defense. This was especially so for the steel rock that was commonly used by the wizard's pagoda, which amplified its physical defense to the extreme. Correspondingly, his self-respect had also reached a shocking level. The Arcana Tower, on the other hand, was made of lightweight materials, some kind of special arcana alloy, on the basis of both physical and magical defense. The biggest advantage of this material was that it was light enough. As a result, an arcane tower of the same model was 100 times lighter than a wizard's pagoda. It was precisely because of this that the arcane tower was defeated in a head-on confrontation with a large creature like the Greater Demon. That was why a 5-meter-tall archdemon was chasing after a 100-meter-tall arcane tower all over the world. The Great Demon wasn't stupid. It could use the precise teleportation spell unique to demonic creatures to evade the fierce attacks of the arcane towers. Then, it would suddenly appear next to the arcane towers and use its even fiercer and wilder attacks to overwhelm the arcane towers. However, only a Greater Demon, who had thick skin and flesh, could do such a thing. A powerful and twisted protective force field, an insane magic-resistant skin, and a powerful demonic body. Without these, any other creature would have been smashed into a bloody pulp by the fierce attacks of the two arcane towers. It was because of this that the Great Demon's attacks were still fierce, even though its body was even more battered by the arcane attacks. Its combat power was not reduced in the slightest. Instead, the two arcane towers kept falling to the ground, and it had to rely on the help of its companions to get back into the sky. The battle between the two had gone on for a long time, and the battlefield stretched for several kilometers. Along the way, all the arcane towers had collapsed, and all the middle and low-level arcanists and arcane apprentices had been massacred. The Great Demon, on the other hand, was only injured but not dead. It was still full of energy and continued to madly tangle with the two arcane towers. Grimm hid himself at the side and took the opportunity to gather some basic information about the Great Demon. Great Demon, level 4 mid-level, demonic creature. Basic stats: Strength 43, Vitality 45, Agility 27, Spirit 31. Combat skills: Precise teleportation, Light of Fear, Evil Attack, Brutal Body. Precise teleportation allowed the Great Demon to teleport to any visible area without barriers or spell formations. The teleportation effect was far better than the low-level demon's Flame Leap. Light of Fear was an area spell similar to a magic barrier. It could cause all creatures within the range of the light to tremble from the depths of their souls, and they would not dare to fight the Great Demon directly. Evil Attack was a racial ability that all demonic creatures had. It could add the corrosive and polluting effect of hellfire to all their attacks. If the target did not try to dispel the evil effect, the wound would never heal. As for the Brutal Body, it was even more terrifying. It gave the Great Demon the strange ability to increase its attack power the more heavily injured it was. Therefore, when fighting a Great Demon, one could not let their guard down until the moment they chopped off its head. Otherwise, it was extremely easy for a Great Demon to turn the tables on them. Grimm could not help but click his tongue in admiration as he appraised the Great Demon's battle skills. Although he had imitated the Balrog's transformation for a period of time, the Abyss Balrog was only a mid-level demonic creature, while the Great Demon in front of him was a genuine upper-class being. If he could overturn it and bring it back as a spoil of war, it would undoubtedly be a great harvest. However, the feedback from chip on the battlefield made Grimm dispel this unwise idea. Although the abyssal Great Demon's body was battered and tattered, its life energy aura was still maintained at 87% and above. To a greater extent, its battered appearance was more like a disguise or bait, luring those spies in the dark to attack it. Faced with a fellow that could destroy the heavens with just its powerful physique, Grimm could only shake his head and sneak away from the side of the battlefield. However, while he could spy on the great demon, other invaders might not be able to. Hence, before Grimm could get far, the werewolf and vixen duo charged towards the great demon without hesitation. Grimm immediately hesitated, not knowing if he should stay and see if there were any opportunities or if he should go somewhere else. However, at this moment, a cold and sinister aura of death suddenly exploded in the distance, mixed with Mangle's flustered and exasperated roars and Chiolicia's screams. The Lich and the two-headed Magus are fighting? Grimm hesitated for a moment, but still chose to sneak into a new battlefield to see what was going on. At this time, the battlefield of the floating city was already a chaotic quagmire of war, engulfing all the invaders and Arcanists. The Arcanists wanted to use their geographical advantage to repel the invaders, while the invaders were fishing in troubled waters. They wanted to take advantage of the chaos to reap even greater rewards. Therefore, any small battle could attract the attention of more predators, and it would make the battle snowball and become bigger and bigger, harder and harder to control. Among all the predators that were attracted by the smell of blood, the siblings Mangles and Chiolicia were undoubtedly the weakest and the easiest targets for prey. Therefore, after the Lich detected the aura of the siblings, it did not hesitate to launch a ferocious attack. A Lich was also an extremely terrifying magical creature. They were not natural creatures, but powerful spellcasters who had reached the end of their lives. In order to continue living, they used a special magic ritual to reincarnate themselves into strange liches. Liches were essentially undead creatures, possessing an almost immortal body and an immortal soul. However, this was just a rumor spread by mortals who did not know the truth. Even liches could not be truly immortal, and they still had a limit to their lives. However, ordinary liches could live for thousands of years, while liches that were demigods, grade 5, could live for tens of thousands of years. Such a span of time could indeed be considered immortal to mortals who only had 100 years of life. However, to all high-energy creatures and extraordinary species, the lifespan of liches was only slightly longer. At the end of their lives, their souls would still decay step by step with the passage of time, turning into a pile of ashes that could no longer be salvaged. It was precisely because liches were strange existences that straddled the line between life and death that most of their attacking abilities were inclined towards instant death spells. Finger of Death, Death Sentence, Cardiac Arrest, Death Spell, Law Death, Ashes and Ashes, Disintegration, Soul Destruction, Withering. It was precisely because there were too many instant death spells to choose from that, when fighting against a lich, if one's soul wasn't tough enough or if one didn't have powerful items to defend against instant death spells, any living being could only tremble like a little white rabbit. And now, the two-headed wizard was as miserable as one could imagine. Facing a powerful lich that had come knocking on their door, Mangles and Chiolicia naturally did not have the chance to hide, and could only transform into their strongest form at the first moment. Mangles' elemental sorcery and Chiolicia's mental ability complemented each other, amplifying each other's abilities and allowing them to cast spells at the same time. Therefore, ordinary grade 4 wizards might really be thrown into confusion if they encountered them. Unfortunately, they were now facing an incomparably powerful veteran lich. The sorcery they shot out all shattered on the powerful lich's jade-white skeletal body, but the other party relied on the lich's body to directly resist them. On the other hand, the opponent's instant death spells, which were comparable to a torrential storm, caused them to spit out blood and their vitality to plummet. Chapter 1120. Sharp-Tooth Vortex, Psionic Storm. As two-headed sorcerers who had fused with each other, they could simultaneously shoot out 2 spells of different natures every time they cast a spell. 2 against 1. If it was an ordinary opponent, it would be difficult to resist their double casting. Unfortunately, their enemy was a terrifying lich known for its strong magic resistance. Ordinary rank 2 spells were immediately immune when they landed on the Lich's body. Only rank 3 or above spells could bring a certain degree of threat and damage to it. It was difficult for Mangles and Shiolisha to instantly cast rank 4 spells with their newly advanced strength. Therefore, from the beginning to the end, the two of them had been using powerful rank 3 spells to fight. When the powerful rank 3 spells landed on the Lich's body, almost half of the elemental power was directly immune or resisted. The remaining half of the power had to be reduced by 70 to 80%, and in the end, the remaining power could only bring slight damage to the Lich. Moreover, when the siblings cast spells, they had to try their best to avoid poison, hypnosis, paralysis, immobilization, diseases, instant death effects, necromancy effects, mental effects, and other related spells. This was because the Lich was directly immune to these types of spells. Therefore, after a series of cuts, in addition to various strange damage reduction spells, there were very few spells that could work on a Lich's body. On the other hand, an instant death spell cast by the Lich could ruthlessly kill the siblings. Instant death spells that ignored physical defense and magic resistance were directly used on the soul. If one wanted to not die, one could only rely on the toughness of the soul to resist. And the result of every resistance was a crazy loss of life force, and the soul could not help but wail. Although it was 2 against 1, it was the Mangles siblings who were being beaten to the point of fleeing like rats. In the end, the Mangles siblings also discovered some tricks to resist the Lich's instant death spells, and that was to catch someone else as a scapegoat. All the instant death spells were either Ray type or Halo type. As long as the siblings could catch an arcane apprentice in advance and throw him on the flight path of the spell, they could directly trigger the instant death effect. In this way, using the life of an arcane apprentice in exchange for the Lich's instant death spell was extremely cost-effective in every aspect. However, that Lich was also a cunning person, so how could he be restrained by the siblings' simple methods? After a large-scale Banshee's Howl was released, there was not a single Arcana apprentice within 1,000 meters that Mangles and his sister could use. They could only retreat as they fought, hoping that the other party would turn around and deal with easier targets as they ran out of patience. Unfortunately, the floating city was filled with ferocious beasts and experts. No matter how he counted, the siblings were the weakest. So, no matter how they tried to dodge, that Lich continued to chase after them, as if he would not stop until he killed them. This time, Mangles and Shiolisha were finally afraid. "Lord Grimm, we know you're nearby. Please come out and save us." Shiolisha screamed for help. "As long as you can save us, we are willing to listen to your orders. All the rewards from this mission will belong to you." The faces of the brother and sister were filled with fear and dread. The elder brother, Mangles, was not satisfied with his sister's promise and thought that he could bargain a little more. However, in the face of the ferocious and terrifying Lich that had sworn to kill them, he could only keep his mouth shut and let his sister make the decision. "Are you serious?" Suddenly, Grimm's familiar clear voice came from the battlefield. "Of course. We're teammates who came here together. How we dare to lie to you?" Hearing Grimm's voice, Shiolisha's eyes that were close to despair once again shone with hope. This trip to the other world was too dangerous. With the siblings' strength, they would not be able to last until the end. Therefore, Shiolisha had long since given up on the idea of taking advantage of this opportunity to make a fortune. She began to accept reality and return to reason. Hee. With a deep laugh, a large ball of flame spread out from the void and swept towards the rank 4 Lich like a cloud. Although Grimm and Shiolisha had been talking in the common language of the sorcerer world, the Lich could not understand them. However, due to the nature of an evil creature, when it sensed Grimm's strange flame approaching, it had already prepared to fight. Hence, when the continuous fiery clouds appeared, the Lich sneered sinisterly and raised a finger. White light flashed from the second segment of his left bony pinky, summoning a terrifying ice wraith whose entire body was sculpted from 10,000-year-old ice. "Ice Ghoul, a rank for puppet. It was an extremely powerful ice undead creature that could not be naturally produced. It could only be refined by a lich in a laboratory. They were the most loyal servants of the lich, and they would charge and break through enemy lines on behalf of the lich. Therefore, when Grimm appeared, the lich did not hesitate to summon an ice ghoul to stall the siblings, while its main body suddenly turned and collided with the fiery cloud. The lich's body was as white as jade, and it was immune to all elemental attacks below rank 3. Therefore, the lich did not care about being a spellcaster at all. After using its body as a shield to break through the flame cloud, it immediately unleashed the most terrifying banshee's howl. The shrill and high-pitched howl quickly enveloped the entire flame cloud. The terrifying sound wave that could tear apart one's soul quickly spread through the air, and it even stirred up layers of fine ripples. Such a terrifying rank 4 banshee's howl was enough to destroy any opponent with a weak soul. If a rank 4 opponent was not careful, they would also suffer a great loss. The flame cloud shook, and the void trembled. In the depths of the sea of flames, Grimm was forced to reveal himself by the lich. He held a flaming coral staff in his hand, a burning corona on his head, a fire dragon pendant around his neck, a flame emblem on his arm, a fearless belt on his waist, and a pair of ash boots on his feet. There were all sorts of strange magic rings on each of his fingers. However, these external items could not cover up Grimm's miraculous power. Although Grimm was not an orthodox physique refinement sorcerer, he did not have monstrous muscles that were as hard as iron. However, with a height of 2 meters, his well-proportioned and well-built body still bestowed him with an almost perfect body. His sturdy muscles, dark red skin, and long black hair were scattered behind his back, slowly dancing in the wind. Coupled with the dark red glow in the depths of his black pupils, Grimm's entire being emitted a demonic, mysterious, and wise sorcerer's aura. Primary rank 4. Unbelievable! The lich exclaimed in admiration. You must be a genius sorcerer from some powerful sorcerer faction. Otherwise, how could you have grasped a part of the law of fire with only the strength of a primary rank 4 sorcerer? When the lich first sensed Grimm's flame aura, he had always treated him as a veteran rank 4 sorcerer. Now that he saw Grimm's youthful face and sensed that his mental energy had not completely stabilized, the lich could not help but open his mouth in shock. Mr. Lich, may I know how to address you? Grimm was not in a hurry to attack. Instead, he tapped his flaming coral staff on the ground and cast a full-scale flame shield on himself. Then, he calmly greeted his opponent. Kongness, what about you? The lich asked coldly. Mr. Kongness, Grimm sends his greetings. Grimm said with a smile. There are so many prey here. Why are you so fixated on us sorcerers? Why don't you kikik? You want to snatch my prey away just by opening your mouth? Do you want to show me what you're made of? The lich was indeed a frequent visitor of the evil faction. He did not allow Grimm to continue negotiating. He raised his hand and shot a green ray at the flame shield. Disintegrate. The flame barrier with 500 points of physical defense and 700 points of elemental defense crumbled the moment it came into contact with the green ray. In the next second, 4 to 5 curses that were either gray, white, green, or dark purple chased after Grimm and sank into his body at the same time. The lich was worthy of being the strongest controller of evil spells. Each of his curses had terrifying spell penetration. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to pass through the burning domain and fire force field to directly affect Grimm. Delay, loss of will, aging, pain, oblivion. There were 5 curses in total, and all of them took effect. The sluggish curse could greatly reduce Grimm's movement speed. The loss of will could weaken Grimm's will to fight. The aging curse caused Grimm's basic attributes to decrease by a small amount. The pain curse could cause Grimm to suffer double the damage. The Oblivion curse could cause Grimm to forget a portion of his spells. When all the curses took effect, the Lich Kongness raised a skeletal hand and shot a series of bone spears at Grimm from all directions. The sharp ends of the bone spears were burning with deathly white flames. Any living being that came into contact with these flames would have their souls frozen, and even the speed at which their thoughts operated would slow down greatly. After finishing his attack, the Lich Kongnus silently crushed the pinky of his right hand and used his body as a sacrifice to unleash a terrifying finger of death. It turned into a gray ray that shot towards the frozen Grim. The Finger of Death was a terrifying death-type spell. Now that the Lich Kongnus had used his body as a sacrifice to increase its penetrative power, its damage was even more frightening. It was just a casual conversation, yet the other party had mercilessly dealt so many fatal blows. Let alone the outsiders. Even Grim was shocked to the point where he could hardly contain himself. Chapter 1121. Crimson Lotus Rain. Scorching Flames. Grim roared out a short incantation and summoned a torrent of flames to attack the Lich. The flames were golden in color and contained traces of a strange power that was different from the past. The moment the golden flames collided with the aura of death around Kongnus, the two different energies started a frenzied battle to devour and destroy each other. The golden flames and the pale aura of death clashed in the air, intertwining and destroying each other. The moment the golden flames appeared, the negative curses that Kongnus had placed on Grim's body evaporated like snow under the scorching sun. The rest of them could no longer influence and interfere with Grim's every move like before. The source of the two energies used every second they had to cast all sorts of terrifying spells to pave the way for the final victory. At the level of the Lich and Grim, even if they didn't use incantations, they could still summon all kinds of powerful spells. But when their opponent was someone of the same level, it was better for them to use incantations to create a real threat to their opponent. Instantaneous spells were mostly used to disrupt the opponent's spellcasting rhythm. After a series of crazy and cruel modifications, the Lich would transform every part of their body into a terrifying spell sequencer. Their spellcasting method was also completely different from normal spellcasters. That was why when Kongnus sensed the terrifying power of the golden flames, he sped up his spell casting without hesitation. His terrifying skull stared at Grim, who was treading on flames. In his eye sockets, the soul fire hidden behind the large red gems flickered rapidly. His upper and lower jaws also began to shake rapidly, producing a strange clacking sound. It wasn't that he was trembling in fear, but it was a unique spell-casting method of the Lich. In his open mouth, his upper and lower jaws were embedded with magical gems of different colors and functions. He used his upper and lower jaws to tap and activate the gems in a rhythmic manner. Because of that, he didn't even need to cast a spell. The Lich had long since stored a terrifying spell in it and condensed it into a powerful spell sequence that frantically flew towards Grim. Why were Liches regarded as extremely cruel and terrifying top-notch magical creatures in every plane? What he relied on was this extremely unique spell-casting method. Such a spell sequence was usually a combination of anti-magic spell plus offensive elemental spell plus compound curse plus instant death spell. Among them, magic penetration spells were responsible for breaking through the opponent's external magical defenses. Offensive elemental spells were responsible for causing elemental damage or triggering the opponent's deep defenses. Compound curses were responsible for weakening the opponent's elemental resistance, and the death-like spells were the true core of the sequence. Such a terrifying spell had helped Kongnus defeat and kill countless enemies who came to challenge him. However, this method was far from enough to deal with Grim, who had also grasped a portion of the Law of Fire. The raging flames suddenly shrank. A strange golden shield formed between Grim and Kongnus. The shield wasn't large or thick, but it was unusually solid due to the golden flames. A series of spells struck the golden shield. The anti-magic spell caused the elemental particles to become restless and destroyed the existing spell model. Unfortunately, the Law of Fire contained within was of a higher level than the anti-magic spell, so the damage wasn't thorough enough. Even though the golden shield was affected by the anti-magic spell, it still managed to restrict the elemental particles within a certain range. This greatly affected the subsequent spell sequences. The terrifying bone arrow, the dark red berserk spell, and the terrifying energy absorption spell were detonated prematurely. They blossomed into a crimson aura of death in front of the broken golden shield. While defending against the Lich's attack, Grim waved his staff and shot out lava fireballs that were half the size of a human. In terms of elemental damage, a Grade 4 blazing fireball was far stronger than a Grade 2 lava fireball. Unfortunately, the Lich's elemental resistance was too high and elemental damage was far less effective than physical damage. That was why Grim could only choose the Grade 2 lava fireball. Even when Grim fired a Tier 2 lava ball, the power it contained was far greater than ordinary Tier 2 lava balls. It was a huge fireball made of pure lava and raging flames, filled with shockingly hot liquid lava. Endless light and heat penetrated through the cracks in the lava, roasting the entire space and making the heat waves unbearable. Grim shot out hundreds of such lava fireballs at once. One after the other, the moment the first one was shot out, the outline of the second one could be seen clearly. They hit the Lich's skeletal wall like cannonballs, and a lava rain that exploded burned the skeletal wall, making it crackle. The skulls that formed the bone wall were burned red by the high-temperature flames. They raised their necks and struggled to escape the bondage of the bone wall. This wall of bones that was 20 meters wide and 1 meter thick only lasted for 5 seconds before collapsing with a deafening roar, scattering bone fragments all over the ground. The subsequent lava fireballs were blocked by a new skeletal wall. With the support of a few more walls, Kongnus finally completed a new spell sequence. Kongnus sacrificed the 7th rib on his right side and summoned a group of hazy, terrifying banshees. They screamed as they charged into the sky. Although these banshees were only Grade 3, their ear-piercing screeches were a huge disturbance to human spellcasters. After summoning the troublemakers, Kongnus reached out with his right bony hand and waved it in the air, drawing out evil runes that glowed green. But before the runes could form a terrifying death spell, Kongnus' soul flame behind the ruby in his eye sockets trembled. He hurriedly gave up on the spell and retreated 100 meters. The moment his silhouette appeared in the air, a terrifying fire spell erupted from his original position. Mount Doomsday! The scorched, withered earth quickly bulged and cracked. Countless streams of high-temperature flames and streams of scorching red magma shot out from within, quickly melting everything in the surroundings into a world of lava. If Kongnus didn't escape in time, he would have to endure the full might of Mount Doomsday. Now, he only needed to endure a little. He just needed to warm up a little. With a Grade 4 Lich's magic resistance, a 7,000-degree flame was nothing more than a spring breeze to him. But to most existences on the plane, this spring breeze could melt metal and rock. It could even melt volcanic rocks into liquid. Kongnus, having his spell interrupted, wasn't willing to take a beating for nothing. He activated a spell ring on his left hand and threw a poison bone spear at Grim. It wasn't an ordinary bone spear, but a strange bone spear imbued with the aura of death. It could ignore all physical defenses. The tip of the bone spear was also coated with rotting seeds. Once it came into contact with flesh, it would spread the seeds of plague. Grim, who was preparing his next fire spell, paled at the sight of such a terrifying bone spear. He hurriedly dispersed his body and turned into a streak of flames to escape. And so, the two spellcasters, whose spellcasting abilities were at the pinnacle of the realm, attacked each other while dodging each other's attacks. One after another, they attacked crazily and then quickly fled, turning the large space into a battlefield for their battle. During that time, a few arcanists tried to take advantage of the situation with their arcane towers, but they were chased away by the two fellows. No matter how stupid the Lich and Grim were, they wouldn't stoop so low as to get bitten by a rabbit. Therefore, after a few attempts, the arcanists could only try their best to hide far away, silently watching the two invaders fight in the inner ring of the floating city. Grim wasn't the only battlefield like this. 3 or 4 other battlefields erupted with terrifying energy fluctuations one after another. The most eye-catching one was the battle between the Lesser Disaster Lord, Siahuf, and a fifth-ring Great Arcanist. It could be said responsibly that the ripples of energy released from that battle had far surpassed the level of a level 4. That also meant that the sixth-stage Lord of Extreme Night, standing behind Siahuf, had probably projected a portion of his power over. Those weaker than him wouldn't even dare to participate in a battle like that. They couldn't even watch from the sidelines. As such, they were chased out by the transcendent power and could only stay around the arcane spell hall. That way, the chances of conflict between the two sides would only increase. The energy core of the floating city had been completely destroyed by Siahuf. After being trampled and destroyed by so many powerful beings from other realms, it had become more and more dilapidated and desolate. Large areas of the arcane spell buildings had been destroyed due to the battle, and the floating city was slowly losing its ability to float. Chapter 1122. The floating city was crashing. This meant that there was not much time left for the invaders to plunder resources and treasures. Therefore, the battle above the floating city was getting more and more intense. In the inner ring of the floating city, in an Arcana Academy 7 kilometers west of the Arcana Palace, a unique lecture was still going on. It was still the same Hall of Knowledge, and it was still the same two familiar figures. Lucia was sitting in the first row of the spacious Hall of Knowledge, listening carefully to Mr. Brown's lecture. Today, Mr. Brown was talking about the origin of life, which also included some of his own views and insights. The vast Hall of Knowledge was empty, except for Lucia and him. His gentle voice echoed in the hall, and even the earth-shattering roar of the elements outside could not cover it. The origin of life has different theoretical views in different planes. In the planes ruled by the gods, their unified explanation is that life is created by the gods. All the things in the world, all the creatures in the planes are created by the great gods with their bodies or blood combined with some plane matter. Although these fakes have used this set of theories to deceive many ignorant believers, it is difficult for their theories to be self-justifying. At least they can explain where the gods come from. Speaking of this, Mr. Brown could not help but laugh. Through the translucent crystal wall behind him, he could vaguely see an Arcana tower in the distant sky being knocked down by the enemy, falling on the surface of the floating city and causing an earth-shattering explosion. The shockwave quickly spread to the Arcana Academy, causing a large number of buildings to continue to shake and shake. Even the Hall of Knowledge that the two of them were in began to shake slightly, and from the exquisite arched dome of the sky, countless ashes and broken pieces of porcelain fell. But the two in the hall did not care at all, and were still seriously talking and listening. Most of the creatures in the plains live in ignorance for their whole lives, and they do not even realize that they are in a sealed space protected by the boundary membrane of the plane. Only those awakened high-level consciousness will realize this problem and try to find the answer, and their answer lies in the void of the plane. The plane is not real. The void is not empty. Every plane of existence is pieced together from all sorts of strange substances that were swept in from the void. Originally, they were all cold substances without any intelligence or consciousness. There were no animals or plants in them. However, after the plane of membrane fused, it completely enveloped the entire world, isolating it from the powerful and terrifying void storm outside. Then, in less than 100 years, strange life seeds will be born from nothing in the boundary membrane. Speaking of this, Brown couldn't help but look up at the starry sky. His voice was filled with awe and longing for the strange universe. The Empire has been investigating the life forms of the planes for thousands of years. During this period of time, the Grand Arcanist with the power to destroy the heavens and the earth even personally created a primordial plane and then spent hundreds of years overseeing the process of life in the plane growing from nothing. Then where did the first life form born in this plane come from? Lucia couldn't help but widen her eyes. She licked her lips and asked eagerly, Beyond the realm, the endless void. Brown couldn't help but sigh. Outside the plane, the endless void. Lucia couldn't help but repeat. Yes, just like you. The Grand Arcanist also felt that it was inconceivable. The first source of life in the plane actually came from outside the plane. Brown sighed for a moment, then returned to normal. After the Grand Arcanists reached this conclusion, they conducted all sorts of investigations and found that the majority of the creatures in the plane of existence were actually as high as 87% similar. Although some of the creatures in different planes and different environments have undergone some changes in body shape and bones, when it comes to the root, they still originate from the same source of life. Outside the Hall of Knowledge, loud rumbling sounds came unceasingly. A continuous stretch of heavenly fire fell from the sky, melting a large part of the Arcane Academy's building into a baked cake. The whole world began to silently burn, and at the end of the line of sight, an indomitable flame giant was roaring angrily. Every move it made sprinkled a steady stream of flames, as if it was fighting a powerful enemy. The arcane barrier on the surface of the hall had not yet dissipated, and it was barely able to block the rapidly rising, terrifying air waves from the outside world. However, the arcane glyphs etched on the thick stone pillars around the hall had already been slightly damaged due to the previous shock. Some strange flames penetrated the gap in the arcane barrier, and the temperature inside the hall began to rise slowly. The surrounding buildings had collapsed and melted one after another, and because of the existence of Arcanist Brown, the arcane barrier in the Hall of Knowledge was still operating with difficulty. But looking at the harsh and terrible environment around, it wouldn't be able to hold on for too long. Since the Grand Arcanists have already detected the source of life and the plane of existence, didn't they trace the real source of life? Lucia asked eagerly with a red face. The cruelty and fierceness of the void of the plane can't be imagined by those who haven't experienced it. It's in order to explore the mystery of the depths of the sea of stars and explore the origin of life in the plane of existence that the Grand Arcanists built the powerful half-plane fortress. Following a certain fixed track, they conquered one plane of existence after another. Before the Empire faced this crisis, the Arcane Kingdom had found and conquered a total of 2,317 planes, and turned them into our secondary planes or resource planes. Some of the Grand Arcanists still believe that if we can leave our footprints in all the plane worlds and radiate the power of the Arcane Kingdom to every corner of the multiverse, then any secret will no longer be a secret in our eyes. The whole multiverse will be like the arcane garden behind our house. We can take whatever we want. Teacher, isn't this thinking deviating from our starting point? If we go on like this, what's the difference between us and those creatures of disaster? Lucia's face showed a look of pain and struggle, and she couldn't help but shake her head in distress. Little Lucia, do you think all people are like you, always maintaining that original idea? Decrypting the source of the plane, exploring the truth of the universe. Such an idea, every one of us can do it at the beginning. But when our power is getting stronger and stronger, and the knowledge we gather is getting larger and larger, we could destroy a plane and a world by raising our hands and feet. At that time, can we still calm down and continue to pursue our truth? Brown sighed leisurely. After countless arcanists, countless years of exploration and speculation, the upper echelons of the Arcane Kingdom firmly believe that the multiverse we live in may not be the only one, let alone the whole. There may be a similar living space outside the multiverse. And in order to maintain the activity and flow of internal life, there's also a strange exchange of matter and life between different multiverses. There is exchange between multiverses, and within the multiverse, there's also a hidden and inevitable exchange of matter and life between planes. When Lucia heard that, she couldn't help but open her mouth in surprise and couldn't help but murmur, If this exchange really exists, then who is the first driving force? Is it true that there's a supreme life in the multiverse that explores and controls everything in the multiverse? Little Lucia, You should already know that when the creatures in every plane world multiply and grow, they will give birth to a hazy and instinctive plane consciousness. This plane consciousness will control the laws of the plane and let the entire plane world operate according to a certain law or instinct. So, does our Morian plane also have a plane consciousness? Lucia opened her eyes curiously. Of course. You, me, and any life and any tiny bit of matter in the Morian plane are part of the great plane consciousness. If you have a chance to advance to a level 1 arcanist, at the moment of advancement, you can briefly touch the great plane consciousness. Brown looked at the clever and studious apprentice in front of him dotingly. Although the two of them didn't have a teacher-disciple relationship, at this moment, deep in his heart, he had already regarded her as his own disciple, teaching and inheriting. Lucia frowned and thought hard. She really couldn't imagine what such a huge plane world would be like once it gave birth to a plane consciousness. Would it also have feelings of joy, anger, sorrow, or pain like human beings or ordinary creatures? Then how would it control the creatures of the plane? Outside the hall, the rumbling of the elements became louder. The battle of the flame giants in the distance seemed to be getting closer and closer to the Hall of Knowledge. The outer walls of the hall had been baked red by the terrifying high temperature, and the towering dome began to soften, with crimson molten lava flowing down drop by drop. Arcanist Brown waved his hand, and a tall arcane puppet standing at the side walked over, using its huge body and wide arms to block the falling ceiling for them. The temperature in the hall became even more unbearable. At this moment, the floating city had fallen nearly half its height, and the entire foundation of the city had tilted 45 degrees. Most of the ground had begun to burn and collapse. Looking out from the crystal walls around the Hall of Knowledge, the entire horizon was slanted. There were flames everywhere outside, and battles were everywhere. It was like the end of the world. Chapter 11:23. However, at that moment, Brown and Lucia had completely disregarded life and death. They were still in this simple and narrow safe house, asking and answering questions, immersed in the joy of knowledge inheritance and acquisition. Perhaps the world would be destroyed in the next second, and perhaps the two of them would be reduced to ashes in the next second. But at this moment, they were still persisting and putting their simple and stubborn beliefs into practice. That was the belief they made on the first day they came into contact with arcane knowledge, and they were willing to give everything they had for it, even their lives. That might be the fundamental reason why the arcane kingdom could rise so quickly in just a short period of nearly 10,000 years and become a powerful force in the multiverse. Hearing the explanation of the Arcanist Brown, the desire and expectation in Lucia's eyes became stronger. However, just as she opened her mouth to continue to ask some questions, there was an earth-shattering bang. The arcane barrier of the Hall of Knowledge could no longer withstand the burning of the terrifying flame. It burst into flames and fireworks all over the sky. The billowing heat wave and the heavenly fire instantly poured into the hall. Lucia felt as if she had been thrown into a lava volcano. The tumbling and shaking air was filled with terrifying heat. And her clothes, long hair, skin, as well as the blood and bones in her body, were rapidly drying and withering under the terrifying high temperature. There was a tendency to turn into ashes in an instant. And she tried her best to turn her head and look somewhere outside the hall. There, a colossal flame giant was standing proudly, striding into the Hall of Knowledge. What a towering flame giant it was. Looking at the body that was surrounded by flames, she could see the figures of flame elves flying cheerfully everywhere. She could feel the burning sensation brought by the high-temperature flame flow everywhere. The tall and towering body of the other party was projecting endless light and heat outwards. Just by looking at the flame giant, it had already made Lucia's eyes burn, and her whole body began to melt like a roasted candle. Not only her, even Brown, who had the strength of a level 2, couldn't bear the mighty power of the flame giant at close range. His clothes were ignited first, Then the skin on his face, hands, and body began to have large patches of blisters, and his whole body fell into a state of extreme pain. If he was an ordinary person, perhaps he would have turned into ashes the moment the burning domain covered him. It was because of his second circle Arcana Master's strength that he had been able to hold on for more than 10 seconds in the field of fire, but he had also suffered a lot because of it. However, even in such a painful situation, Brown still did not protect himself. Instead, he injected all of his arcane power into the arcane barrier outside Lucia's body. Meanwhile, he himself was quickly incinerated into ashes by the exploding flames, turning into a horrifying charred corpse. However, a second-ring Arcana Master wouldn't be able to survive Grimm's burning domain even if he used all of his strength. Therefore, Lucia, whom Brown had protected at the cost of his own life, did not live more than a few seconds longer than him. As the power of the arcane barrier was rapidly consumed, Lucia also began to follow the footsteps of Brown and quickly began to die. Power. So this is the so-called power. Lucia's eyes were burned into empty holes. She stared blankly at the flame giant and couldn't help but mutter to herself. The moment the arcane barrier was burned through, her body also turned into ashes. Even her soul began to melt bit by bit under the strange flames. Just as her soul was about to perish, a resounding and unfamiliar voice suddenly sounded from the depths of her soul. What a pure soul. With that, a strange hole seemed to open up in the depths of the flames. Lucia's soul was involuntarily sucked into the black hole, and she could no longer feel anything. Grimm weighed the pearl of darkness in his hand, and sensed that the weak soul was still standing muddle-headed within. He nodded in satisfaction and put the pearl away. That moment was very strange. Although he had killed 2 fellows casually, the AI chip had strangely sensed the aura of the projection of the planes while on one of them. Moreover, that fellow was the weaker of the 2, probably just an arcane acolyte. Logically speaking, it was impossible for such a fellow to attract the attention of the plane's will. However, when Grimm waved his hand and incinerated them into ashes, the AI chip had truly felt a slight undulation from the plane's will. It was an indescribable feeling. It was as if the Morian planes had been silently watching over this weak, arcane acolyte. Hence, when Grimm accidentally killed him, he attracted the deep hatred and malice of the plane's will. Hence, out of curiosity, with a thought, Grimm used the Tier 5 Darkness Orb's strange shadow power to trap this weak soul within. After doing all this, Grimm shook his body and slowly retreated from his flame giant form, returning to his human form. The battle between him and the Lich Kongnas did not have an outcome. When the terrifying battle between the Evil Hoof and the Great Arcanist broke out in the Arcane Temple in the center of the floating city, the Lich Kongnas finally gave up on his battle with Grimm. He turned around and rushed towards the distant battlefield with a Grade 4 Frost Wraith. From the looks of it, it seemed that he wanted to take advantage of the conflict between the Sandpiper and the Clam. Although Grimm was not afraid of the Lich, he still chose to search for some spoils of war in the periphery after considering his own strength. As for Mangles and Chiolisha, they had obviously suffered quite a bit of injuries from the battle with the Frost Wraith and could only find another place to heal. Therefore, Grimm decided to stay in the Arcane Magic Academy and walked around as he pleased. After passing through a few half-collapsed corridors and turning a few corners, Grimm suddenly found a black wooden door with faint elemental undulations at the end of a corridor. Grimm pushed it with his hand, but it did not budge. There was a strange bronze face on the black wooden door. With a flash of yellow light, the bronze face slowly opened its eyes. Password, password. This is the secret library of the Dorndale Arcane Academy. Outsiders are not allowed to enter. If you want to enter, please say the password. Hearing the strange voice that sounded almost mechanical, Grimm's eyes sharpened in annoyance. A wave of golden flames swept out, burning a hole large enough for him to pass through. How could a mere arcane gate stop a Type 4 powerhouse from entering? Beep. Strange warning detected. The AI chip quickly intoned. Obviously, Grimm's forceful intrusion had triggered the defense mechanism of the library. Under normal circumstances, a large number of fully armed arcanists would have rushed over to surround Grimm. Unfortunately, at this moment, the entire floating city was in a mess. Even the Arcane Academy in the Central District had suffered from the attack of the Evil Hoof. So how could those arcanists with a bit of strength come to this remote place to cause trouble for Grimm? Therefore, Grimm ignored the warning and stepped into it. He looked around silently. This was an extremely spacious and bright library. Rows of golden bookshelves filled with books could be seen everywhere, densely packed with thick books that faintly emitted an arcane aura. Looking at the exquisite decorations on the covers and the faint arcane aura, it was obvious that these were not ordinary goods. Seeing everything here, Grimm could not help but frown slightly. Restrictions. There were too many restrictions. It was obvious that in order to prevent people from overstepping their authority to read the books, all the arcane technique manuals have been sealed and protected by powerful arcane runes. Although the floating city had lost the support of arcane energy, these runes were still intact. It seemed like there was a small elemental pool below the library that was supporting its operation. Grimm had no interest in destroying the elemental pool. He slowly browsed through the rows of bookshelves. Whenever he was interested in a certain arcana technique manual, his eyes would shoot out two streaks of crimson flames, forcefully corroding the arcana technique glyphs. Then, he would reach out and grab the book, stuffing it into the Elder's Ring of Authority. Due to the lack of time, Grimm did not have that much time to slowly unlock every rune, so he could only use the most clumsy method. Of course, if Grimm did not care about the damage to the books, he could just throw out a flaming storm and burn through most of the runes. However, if he did that, many arcane technique manuals would not be able to remain intact. Listening to the tsunami-like sounds of elemental explosions and the occasional violent tremors, one could imagine how chaotic and torturous the floating city was right now. Grimm, on the other hand, had completely given up on everything and began to focus on collecting and looting the arcane technique manuals here. Different from Grimm's leisurely attitude, in another place not far away, two strange figures were following the lingering flame in the air to the Arcana School. Then they arrived at the knowledge hall that had completely collapsed and melted. The original location of the hall had turned into a terrifying pool of lava. All the stone walls, pillars, and rubble had disappeared, leaving only gurgling streams of terrifyingly hot liquid lava. I've already sensed that bastard's aura. He's in a secret room not far away from here. Let's go and kill him. The one who spoke was a strange black figure walking in front. Even though the sky was bright and the light shone on this strange black figure, it was still difficult to see her face and body clearly. They could only vaguely tell that she was a woman, and an abnormally powerful one at that. The guy following behind her looked frustrated and angry, but he could not do anything to her. Will you keep your word? If I help you kill Grimm, will you set me free? Judging from the voice, the person behind him was Wizard Hori, who had disappeared on the battlefield. At this moment, he was wearing the silver robe, but there was a strange black rune branded on his forehead, which was constantly emitting a strange magical wave. You've already been implanted with a seed of darkness. Normal witchcraft will not be able to get rid of it. So, as long as you help me kill Grimm, I'll swear in the name of the origin of darkness that I'll definitely get rid of the seed of darkness. The black figure was the resurrected dark witch Shani. Chapter 1124. But I still have the oath on me. What if Wizard Holly was still hesitating? Through this arduous journey, he finally understood the terrifying power of the legendary fire wizard. To be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that he was the life controller, he wouldn't want to make an enemy out of him. Before Wizard Holly could finish his sentence, he suddenly bent over and started coughing violently. He opened his mouth and spat out a puff of purplish black blood. The blood splattered on the ground. It was sticky, and there seemed to be pieces of flesh, organs, and tissues mixed in it. As he coughed violently, the wizard robe on his body fluttered open, revealing his horrifying body that was riddled with scars. The sneak attack from the werewolf and the fox girl had left him with injuries that could not be healed in a short period of time. Now that he was under Shunny's control, his condition could be said to be extremely weak and miserable. Unfortunately, his life and death did not seem to be within the scope of the dark with Shunny's attention. Hearing Wizard Holly's muttering, Shunny fiercely retorted, "Holly, no matter what, you are still a Tier 4 wizard who has been promoted for over 100 years. Don't tell me you can't even withstand the backlash of this little oath. Here, with this amulet of life, you won't have to worry about that oath anymore, right?" After saying this, Shunny took out a brass cross-shaped sculpture from her waist pouch and threw it to Holly. Holly hurriedly caught it and carefully wore it around his neck, sticking it close to his chest. After being held hostage by Shunny, his storage ring had fallen into her hands, and most of his personal wizard equipment had become her spoils of war. As for Shunny, she had relied on robbing Helly to rearm herself. Although their attributes weren't compatible, considering that Xia and I was currently poor, she didn't have the qualifications to be picky about who she disliked. With a simple modification, she could barely control it. Therefore, this amulet of life that Shunny had casually thrown out was actually Holly's. Now, it was just returning it to its rightful owner. "Let's go. That Grimm seems to be busy with something. We can join forces and attack him. In a while, I'll make the first move, and then you'll unleash your full strength and give him a good beating. If we succeed, I'll give you back your freedom. If you still have this kind of attitude when the battle starts, you know the consequences." Hearing Shunny's threat, Wizard Holly's face turned gloomy. His current condition was extremely poor. His external and internal injuries were about to destroy his body. If he hadn't relied on magic tools and potions to survive, he would have died long ago. Right now, his body was like a broken house, barely holding on. If the seed of darkness that the other party planted in his body caused a ruckus again, it would be fatal. Therefore, no matter how unwilling he was, he could only bow his head and obey. In a library, Grimm quickly broke the arcane rune circles one after another, collecting all the strangely shaped books that were glowing with arcane radiance and putting them into his ring. Just as he was excitedly doing all this, the few eyes of fire that he left outside seemed to have captured something strange and transmitted a dynamic image to Grimm's mind. Holly and Shunny. It seemed like they had found their way here. As soon as he saw the dark witch Shunny, who had just been resurrected, Grimm's face revealed a trace of murderous intent. The other party's stubbornness and unwillingness to let him off had clearly deeply angered him. If there was a chance, he would not allow the other party's soul to return to the pool of spiritual energy. Unknowingly, when this spacious and obvious hall of knowledge suddenly became dim, a black whirlpool suddenly appeared, slowly drifting around every corner of the Hall of Knowledge. Wherever they passed, light seemed to be absorbed, and the entire space gradually became dark and gloomy. A few arcane crystals embedded in the walls originally projected a bright and gentle light, illuminating the entire hall. At this moment, they were entangled by the black whirlpools, and the hall became dark and gloomy. Although the Hall of Knowledge was huge, Grimm had only taken less than 100 books. Grimm frowned as he looked at the remaining books, but he still chose to give up in the end. The enemy had already come, and the plundering had to stop. In a while, this place would become the battlefield of a few Grade 4 wizards, and by that time, there would not be 100 books that could survive. Thinking of this, Grimm's hatred towards Shunny became even stronger. In just a few moments, the originally spacious and bright Hall of Knowledge had become so dark that one could not even see their own fingers in front of them. It was filled with strange, sticky, and black shadows. These strange things came from all directions, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws, like thousands of demons in a land of ghosts. Since you're here, then show yourself. What's the point of pretending to be a ghost? Grimm snorted and raised his right hand. A bright, golden flame slowly appeared in his palm, illuminating the space dozens of meters around him. As soon as the shadows entered this area, they were like fish thrown into a pot of boiling oil, making strange, sizzling sounds. They also let out strange squeaks as they escaped from the illumination of the golden flame. Judging from their behavior, these shadowy substances seemed to be alive. As if sensing that Grimm was ready for battle, the tall and slender figure of the dark, which Shunny slowly appeared at the edge of the golden circle. A pair of pitch-black eyes stared at Grimm, filled with an indescribable hatred. Good? This is really good. I really didn't expect that a rookie who just advanced for 20 or 30 years could make me, Shunny, suffer such a great defeat. Very good. Today, I will use your blood to wash away the hatred between us. As soon as she finished speaking, the shadows in the hall suddenly began to boil. Countless shadow arrows appeared out of thin air and shot towards Grimm from all directions like a rain of arrows. Although the golden flame in Grimm's palm blossomed with a dazzling golden light, it continuously destroyed and neutralized the shadow arrows. However, the power of laws contained in it was still too little, and it was difficult for him to defend against such a large amount of shadow energy. The shadow arrows that exploded turned into balls of black ink, and soon, the golden circle of light began to shrink. The shadow arrows that shot deeper were about to touch the defensive force field around Grimm's body. Facing the opponent's ferocious attack, Grimm did not panic in the slightest. He casually waved his hand to release a ring of flames, burning away the shadow objects that had invaded his body. At the same time, he took out a strange black stone from his bosom. Strangely enough, with the appearance of this strange black stone, the shadow objects in the entire hall suddenly stopped. All the shadow arrows that had been formed suddenly exploded at the same time, reverting back to a chaotic shadow substance. Shadow Pearl. How can you control the power within the Shadow Pearl? Seeing this scene and sensing that the shadow energy was gradually getting out of control, the Dark Witch Shunny could not help but scream in shock. From what she knew, the Shadow Pearl was a sacred darkness-type object that only operated according to the will of the Dark Witches. It was impossible for outsiders to control it. It was a pity that she did not know how powerful the AI chip in Grimm's mind was. As long as it was power, regardless of the attribute, the AI chip could find a way to control it. Power was power, and there was no elemental power that belonged to a single person or group. Divine Force was an exception. With the help of the AI chip, Grimm controlled the Shadow Pearl. Although he was not as proficient as the Dark Witches, he could still control the power within. Hence, facing Shunny's attack, Grimm did not need to do anything other than use the Shadow Pearl to repel Shunny's control over the surrounding shadow objects. With Grimm's command, the shadow objects in the entire hall returned to the Shadow Pearl like birds returning to the forest, returning the hall to its original state. Taking drastic measures, without the omnipresent shadow objects, the Dark Witch Shunny was like a fish thrown onto the shore. Not only did she lose her invisibility barrier, she could not even cast most shadow spells. The Dark Witches were a strange combat profession that was somewhere between magi and assassins. Once Grimm forced them out of the shadow space, the danger they posed was greatly reduced, and they could no longer pose a threat to him. Shunny screamed hoarsely, her body emitting a thick, ink-like black smoke. She wanted to wrap herself up once more. Unfortunately, Grimm raised the shadow orb and waved it at her. The black smoke was instantly sucked in, and Shunny, who was trying to sneak away, was once again exposed. "Bastard! You deserve to die!" Shunny screamed frantically. She could only use the shadow objects in her body to summon a Tier 4 shadow dragon, commanding it to attack Grimm in a frenzy. Unfortunately, even though the shadow dragon had a sturdy physique and mighty divine power that weren't inferior to ordinary dragons, its body was also immersed in too much shadow matter. As long as the shadow objects were present, it could not escape the Shadow Pearl's control and binding. Grimm stood proudly with the Shadow Pearl in his hand. Before the shadow dragon could reach Grimm's side, it was already bound by the shadow power that spread out from Grimm's body. Patches of pitch black and deep shadow power quickly spread on the surface of its body, then turned into pitch-black chains that seemed to have substance, firmly binding it. Helly, if you don't act now, I'll activate the Seed of Darkness. With the Shadow Pearl, all of Shuni's attacks were useless against Grim. Hence, she could only place all her hopes on Wizard Helly. Chapter 1125. Seeing Wizard Holly suddenly barge in, Grim's eyebrows twitched slightly. Not only did he not look like he was about to die, but instead, a joyful smile emerged from the bottom of his heart. Wizard Holly, who had transformed into a huge elemental construct, roared and charged towards Grim like lightning with the help of several rays of starlight behind him. Which Shuni, on the other hand, took a step back and reached out her hand to draw in the air, preparing a large-scale dark spell. However, just as Wizard Holly's body was halfway through, he suddenly made a sharp turn in the air. His right hand, wrapped in dazzling starlight, madly pounded towards Shuni's chest. Such a sudden turn of events caught everyone off guard. The sinister smile on which Shuni's face had yet to fade away, and in an instant, it was replaced with a horrified expression. If it was a normal day, it would be almost impossible for a dark witch like her, who mainly focused on agility and spirit, to be ambushed. No one sneak attack could be faster and more hidden than her shadow leap, which could be cast at any moment. However, at this moment, she was fully focused on preparing a large-scale dark spell, so she could not just let it go. Moreover, the entire Hall's shadow matter had been absorbed by the Shadow Pearl. Even if she wanted to use the Shadow Leap to dodge this attack, it would be beyond her power. Therefore, which Shuni was about to go mad with anger. She forcefully stopped the dark spell in her hand, and did not bother to calm down the reverse tide caused by the dark energy in her body. Relying on her super high agility, she forcefully pulled her body over her chest and was ruthlessly hit by the iron fist that was swung towards her lower abdomen. The violent and ferocious strength, coupled with the frightening power of the starlight, instantly turned into a powerful force that penetrated her lower abdomen. The iron fist that was stained with blood came out from her back, and the purplish-black sticky blood turned into a rain of arrows that scattered in all directions. Shuni screamed in pain, and her whole body suddenly exploded into a black fog that filled the sky. The fog violently shot toward the corner of the hall, and only then did it reassemble into her incomparably miserable body. As soon as her body appeared, Shuni staggered 2 steps back. Her hands were tightly covering her exposed abdomen. Large clumps of purplish-black filthy flesh and blood leaked out from the gaps between her fingers, dripping into a pool of blood at her feet. Of course, if it was only the violent strength, no matter how heavy the injuries on Xiani's body were, it would not affect her subsequent battles. As a high-grade magus, with all the magic medicines and tools she carried with her, she could easily heal wounds such as broken limbs and flesh. However, what truly posed a threat to her was the endless power of starlight mixed within the iron fist. These strange and sinister energies pierced into her body like countless steel needles, quickly corroding her bones, flesh, and internal organs. Under the influence of their strange power, Shuni had already lost the precise control and guidance of power to the injured parts of her body. She kept coughing as she stumbled back. Blood kept gushing out her throat, causing her strength to drain rapidly. Why? You, aren't you afraid that I'll detonate the Seed of Darkness in your body? It was a simple sentence, but Shuni stuttered. She even choked with sobs because her throat was blocked by blood. Standing still and slowly retracting its iron fist, the gigantic elemental golem let out a beautiful laughter filled with endless hatred. Scared. Of course I'm scared. But Mr. Grimm has promised that as long as he's here, you won't be able to detonate the Seed of Darkness. Hee, with this promise, do you think I still need to be scared of you? Bullsh asterisk T. The Shadow Pearl is the sacred object of our Dark Witch clan. Only we know how to control it. That bastard only had the Shadow Pearl for less than a month. Shuni's 2 big mouths were overflowing with blood at the same time. Her expression was ferocious and terrifying. It seemed like she didn't believe what the other party said at all. However, when she screamed hoarsely, a dense black halo descended from the sky and covered the surface of the elemental golem. The strange power contained in the halo was exactly the power of shadow. Protection of darkness. Shuni's screams came to an abrupt halt. She couldn't help but murmur the name of this dark spell repeatedly. With the protection of this layer of protection, Shuni's attempt to remotely control the seed of darkness in Wizard Holly's body was a joke. If she wanted to connect to the seed of darkness again, it would be impossible without breaking this layer of protection. It was almost impossible for other powers to isolate the power of shadow, but the power of darkness, which belonged to the same power system, could. Therefore, when the heavily injured Shuni saw this thin layer of black halo that seemed like it would leak with a single poke, her heart almost collapsed in despair. She twisted her stiff neck slowly and turned towards the young fire shaman who was holding the orb in his hand and sneering at her with a smirk. His face was full of mockery, and his eyes were filled with thick disdain. It's just 1 or 2 minor dark spells. It's not that difficult to learn. If there's anything wrong with this protection of darkness, please don't hesitate to point out, Lady Shuni. Xiani's face turned pale in an instant, and her eyes were filled with endless fury. Protection of darkness is a minor spell? This damn bastard. That's a rank 4 buff-type dark spell. Even if Shuni wanted to cast it herself, she wouldn't be able to do it so quickly. Is he really an elemental fire wizard? How? How'd he do it? Under Shuni's furious gaze, the smile on Grimm's face did not diminish. Instead, it became even more radiant and gentle. Normally, he wouldn't be able to cast dark elemental spells with his specialization in fire. However, ever since he obtained the Shadow Pearl, Grimm did not hesitate to order the AI chip to quickly analyze the dozen or so dark elemental spells stored in the database. Grimm had been traveling all over the place for the past few years, and his footprints had already covered the Silver Alliance, the Northern Lands, and the scattered forest of towers. The AI chip's database had collected and sorted out more than 400 spells of various systems. Due to the limitations of his specialization in fire, Grimm was unable to cast any spells other than fire elemental spells. Hence, the spells in the database were only models for modifying and optimizing fire elemental spells. Now that he had the Shadow Pearl, the source of darkness, it was equivalent to having a magus who could continuously supply shadow elemental energy. Grimm only needed to have the AI chip store the model of the dark elemental spell and pour the energy from the Shadow Pearl into it. Then, he would naturally be able to cast dark elemental spells. During the casting process, the Shadow Pearl was the source of energy, and the AI chip in his mind was the controller of the energy. Grimm only needed to observe the entire process, and all he had to do was put on an act. And this was a way to control the Shadow Pearl that he had figured out. However, no one could see through Grimm's act. In their hearts, Grimm was extremely unfathomable. He was actually able to surpass the threshold of the power system and achieve such an inconceivable feat. Faced with such a situation, Shuni's heart crumbled in despair. Magus Holy, on the other hand, attributed it to Grimm's strange elemental talent and did not suspect anything else. Grimm, who had the Shadow Pearl, was already difficult enough to deal with. Now that Holy, who hated her deeply, had joined the fray, Shuni immediately knew that there was nothing she could do. Without hesitation, she prepared to flee again. Unable to leap from shadow, Shuni's body exploded into a cloud of black smoke, and she shot towards the only entrance to the library like an arrow. As she fled, Shuni used all the shadow energy in her body to condense dark, deep, and solid shadow arrows. They shot towards the 2 enemies, hoping to slow them down. Seeing this, Magus Holy panicked and charged towards the broken door against the dense rain of arrows, trying to stop Shuni. The legendary fire Magus remained in his original position, his body not moving at all. He looked at Shuni, who was frantically escaping, his face full of mockery. Seeing the fire Magus expression, Shuni's heart trembled, and she could not help but have an ominous premonition. Damn it, that fire magus definitely has something up his sleeves. What could it be? While thinking quickly, Shunny, who had turned into black smoke, suddenly froze in front of the broken wooden door. She once again condensed into her human form and did not move a single step forward. There, against the light from the passage, stood a tall and mighty figure. Looking at that strange posture and sensing that familiar aura, Shunny's heart suddenly sank to the bottom of a bottomless abyss. It was so cold and stiff that it was difficult for her to even jump. Mangus, Cholisha. Shunny spat out these two names with difficulty. She finally understood what the legendary fire magus had up his sleeves. That cowardly two-headed magus and his sister. Although Shunny did not care about the strength of Mangus and his sister, they were still genuine grade 4 magi after transforming into two-headed magi. If they were to fight without holding back, Shunny, at her peak, was confident that she could defeat or kill this pair of brother and sister who had barely squeezed into grade 4 within a quarter of an hour. But now, sensing the nearly depleted blood and shadow energy in her body, sensing the Magus Holy who was rushing towards her with berserk strength, Shunny finally gave up all hope. Unless the sorcerer god descended, with her current strength, it would be impossible to break through the blockade of Mangus and his sister before Magus Holy arrived. A burst of wild power exploded in front of the wooden door. Chapter 1126. Let me go, Grim, Holy Cholisha. Don't forget, I entered the Morian plane with you. If I die here, the Lord Patriarch will definitely not let you off after we return. If you don't want to be harassed by a group of dark witches every day, then let me go. I'm giving up on this mission. I promise, I will never harass you again. The Northern Witches were indeed a domineering and special group of wizards that ruled the North. Even at this moment of life and death, Shunny's tone was still not soft. Her words were even threatening, and it seemed like she would continue to fight if there was any disagreement. How about forcing her to swear the Origin Oath and then let her go? Cholisha hesitated. Although the siblings had to participate in the battle against Shunny due to Grimm's majestic presence, they still maintained their cautious character. Now that Shunny's life and death were really at the critical moment, they still maintained their cautious character. It cannot be helped. The siblings were not core figures in the Wizard Association, and they were even ostracized by the upper echelons of the association. Otherwise, they would not have been sent to this extremely dangerous battlefield in another plane. Therefore, when they thought of the famous Northern Dark Witch, they felt a little timid in the depths of their hearts. In my opinion, we should just blow up her body again and let her go back naked to resurrect. This way, she will be weak for at least half a month, and it will be impossible for her to interfere with our mission this time. Wizard Holy gritted his teeth and cursed. Although his words were harsh, he obviously did not dare to offend the Dark Witches too much. Since ancient times, the Northern Witches had been the most protective and the most united. Moreover, they were exceptionally rude and domineering. If you offended them too much, these Dark Witches would really dare to sneak attack and assassinate you. Moreover, they were all very good at dark witchcraft, and they had the mana pool to protect their lives. Every one of them did not care about their own safety. Whoever encountered such a group of fearless shadow assassins would probably have a headache. It's good that you know. I admit defeat for this mission. Before I return to the Magus world, I promise. As if sensing the two Magi's fierce appearance, Shunny's wild nature did not change, even though she was restrained by the dark hand and could not move. However, before she could finish her words, the dark hand that Grimm had conjured from the shadow orb suddenly closed and crushed her body into minced meat. Shunny's words stopped abruptly. Even Heli and Cholisha, who were watching from the side, couldn't help but raise their eyebrows. Their eyes were filled with both relief and worry. But this was not the end. Grimm played with the shadow pearl in his hand. He waved it at the pieces of flesh and blood flying everywhere. Countless shadow force appeared out of nowhere and quickly corroded all the flesh and blood. When Grim clasped his hands together, the shadow pearl lit up with a dark and deep black light. Soon after, countless black chains that fluttered in the wind extended out and pierced into the surrounding void like arrows. For no reason, a mournful scream suddenly came from the void. It sounded quite familiar. After a while, the black chains slowly retracted and dragged out a soul that was bound and unable to move. From the looks of it, it was the dark witch Shani who had lost her body again. If it was said that Xia and I was only slightly afraid the last time, then this time she was really afraid. The reason why the dark witches were so fearless was because of their unique ability to resurrect. No matter how many times they were killed, their souls could always escape to the preset pool of spiritual energy through a special method. After 10 days to half a month of recuperation, they would be able to condense a new body. It was this undying profession that made them the most difficult branch of the Northern Witches to deal with. However, this time, before Shani's escaped soul could return to the pool of energy, Grim used the strange characteristics of the Shadow Pearl to drag her back. If anything happened to this soul, she would really die and would never be able to resurrect again. Therefore, the form was stronger than the person. Given the current situation, she had no choice but to lower her head. However, just as Shani's soul trembled and she was about to bargain with Grim, Grim pursed his lips and blew a transparent golden flame onto Shani's soul. Shani's soul was instantly turned into specks of ashes and finally melted into the void. A shrill, soul-piercing howl turned into a lingering sound that lingered in their ears. Harry and Mangus's eyes widened, and they gritted their teeth to prevent themselves from crying out. Their hearts were filled with shock, and there was even a hint of wariness and fear. This was a genuine Grade 4 Dark Witch. She was killed just like that. It had to be known that in the Central Continent's Forest of Towers, any Tier 4 Magus was a powerhouse who could rule over a region. A single Tier 4 Magus could single-handedly prop up a human kingdom and a Magus family that had existed for thousands of years. Among the 3 great organizations, the control over Grade 4 Magi was slightly stricter. However, to be fair, every single Grade 4 Magus was the most precious asset of their organization. No one was willing to use them as cannon fodder. But now, right in front of them, a dark witch with the strength of a Grade 4 Magus, who was famous even in the northern lands where powerhouses gathered, had actually been killed like a chicken or a dog. Even the last trace of her soul had been completely obliterated. How much of a shock did this bring to the 2 Magi's minds? At the very least, Wizard Harry, who had hated Shani just a moment ago, could not help but turn pale, and his heart inexplicably grieved for the death of a rabbit. When they looked at Grim again, they couldn't help but feel a trace of fear and reverence in their eyes. "Don't worry," Grim chuckled. "Since they chose to send Shani to this plane to kill me, it was to prevent anyone from predicting or sensing it. So when we go back, we just need to stick to the same story and insist that Shani died in a battle with a creature from another plane. Those dark witches will not be able to detect the truth of our words." Seeing that the 2's faces were still pale, Grim continued to encourage them. "Moreover, this Morian plane is about to face a great defeat, and everything that happened here will return to chaos along with the collapse of the plane's consciousness. Are you still worried that some powerful beings with prophecies will travel across planes to find the true cause of Shani's death? If that happens, I'm afraid this plane will no longer exist." Hearing this, the 2 Magi's faces became a little better. Of course, these were just self-deceiving words. With the Dark Witch's tyrannical style, the moment they sensed Shani's death, they would not let them go easily. But now that the person had been killed, could it be that the 2 of them still hoped that Grim would come forward and take care of this matter alone? Moreover, this was another plane, and one of them was weak and the other was heavily injured. If they really angered Grim and he killed them, they were afraid, perhaps they had all realized this. Wizard Harry and the Mangle's sibling smiled at the same time and began to scold Shani for being despicable and shameless. Looking at the way they gritted their teeth, it seemed that if Shani appeared in front of them, They would skin her alive and burn her to ashes again. However, no one knew what they were thinking about in private. Since you have no objections, then let's do it this way. Just say that Shunny died in a battle with the disaster Lord Evilhoof. By the way, why do these equipment that Shunny left behind look so familiar? They should all be wizard Heries, right? If that's the case, just take them back. Looking at the equipment that was left behind after Shunny's ashes, Wizard Herie retrieved them one by one with a bitter face. Although these equipment were all his at this moment, he really could not feel happy. After dealing with Shunny's matter, Grim looked around the library and could not help but let out a sigh. Although the battle just now was short and the scale was not big enough, it still brought a devastating blow to the library. The entire Hall of Knowledge seemed to have been ravaged by a level 10 typhoon. All of the bookshelves, wooden tables, and wooden chairs were swept to the side. The books that were once protected by the arcane array glyphs had now lost their arcane aura and were corroded into dust by the wild eruption of dark energy. This place was already destroyed beyond recognition, so there was no point in continuing to search here. Boom! Suddenly, a loud sound came from the top of the hall, and a large amount of dust and gravel fell from the ceiling. Ah, Fry, you bitch. You only dared to fight me because of the arcane barrier. How dare you injure my body? Just you wait. When my main body projects its power here, I'll swallow you in one bite. The strange hissing sound of evil hoof came from the void. The sound was sharp and resounding, almost piercing people's eardrums. From the sound of it, it seemed like Evil Hoof had suffered a little loss at the hands of the Fifth Circle Great Arcanist. Let's go take a look. Maybe we can get something good. Grim laughed, and a cold light shot out from his eyes. Grim, Master, you see the seed of darkness in my body? Herie hesitated for a moment, and finally straightened his posture. Don't panic. This seed of darkness is still in a dormant state, so it won't affect you too much. Also, I haven't fully understood the power of a shadow pearl, so it will be a little troublesome to get rid of it in a short period of time. Don't worry, in a few days, when I understand its use, getting rid of the seed of darkness for you will be as easy as lifting a finger. After saying this, Grim took the lead and walked out of the library. The manga siblings followed closely behind. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.